Welcome, gentle wanderer, to the tale of transformation and love that spans the long life of Yennefer of Vengerberg. Tonight, we trace the journey of a soul who began as society's cast-off, a hunchbacked child deemed monstrous by those who should have cherished her, and witness her evolution into one of the most powerful sorceresses the world has ever known. This is a story of beauty won through sacrifice, of love discovered through pain, and of a woman who learned that true magic lies not in spells or potions, but in the choice to open one's heart to others despite every reason to keep it closed. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift as we explore the extraordinary life of a woman who defied every limitation placed upon her. Close your eyes when you feel ready, and let us begin. In the harsh northern kingdom of Vengerberg, where winter winds cut through stone and hope seemed as scarce as summer warmth, there was born a child whose arrival brought not joy, but sorrow to the house that should have welcomed her. The baby girl who would one day command the respect of kings and strike fear into the hearts of armies emerged into the world already marked by cruelty, her spine curved in ways that nature never intended, her small body twisted by forces beyond anyone's understanding or control. Her father's first words upon seeing his daughter were not the tender expressions of paternal love that should greet every newborn, but a harsh command that would echo through the child's memories for decades to come. "Take that hunchbacked monster away from me," he shouted, his voice filled with disgust and rejection so complete that it seemed to poison the very air of the birthing chamber. The man who should have been her protector became her first and most devastating enemy, setting in motion patterns of abandonment and cruelty that would shape every relationship she would ever attempt to form. Her mother, caught between the love she felt for her daughter and the revulsion of her husband, became a figure of tragic contradiction in the child's early life. In quiet moments, when her father was away attending to his business or visiting his mistress, the woman would hold her deformed daughter with genuine tenderness, singing soft lullies and offering the kind of maternal comfort that every child deserves. But when her husband returned, when his presence filled the house with tension and barely contained violence, that same mother would transform into someone else entirely, pushing the child away and avoiding her gaze as if the sight of her own daughter caused physical pain. The accusations that flew between her parents during their increasingly frequent arguments revealed the deeper currents of shame and superstition that surrounded her birth. Her father, seeking someone to blame for his disappointment, would rage about elven blood in his wife's family line, about sorceresses and their unnatural influence, about pregnancies that should have been ended before they could bring such shame upon his house. These were not the private whispers that adults typically used when discussing sensitive matters, but shouted recriminations delivered with full knowledge that their daughter could hear every word. The child learned early that her very existence was viewed as evidence of cosmic injustice, a mistake that the universe had made and her family was forced to endure. She understood, long before she had words to express the knowledge, that she was fundamentally different from other children, marked by something that made her unworthy of the basic love and acceptance that seemed to flow naturally to everyone else. The curved spine that made walking difficult and standing straight impossible became a visible symbol of all the ways in which she failed to meet the world's expectations. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of her childhood was not the physical deformity itself, but the way it was used to justify every form of emotional abandonment and neglect that followed. When her father struck her for asking why she looked different from other children, when her mother turned away rather than answer questions about why people stared, when servants whispered about the monster child who brought bad luck to any house that sheltered her, the hunchback became both cause and excuse for treatment that no child should ever endure. The isolation that such treatment created was profound and comprehensive. Other children, taking their cues from the adults around them, learned to avoid her or worse, to actively torment her as a creature that existed outside the normal boundaries of human sympathy. The games and friendships that should have filled her childhood were replaced by long hours spent alone, developing the kind of fierce independence that comes from understanding that no one else will provide comfort or protection when the world becomes too harsh to bear. Yet within this crucible of rejection and pain, something remarkable was taking shape. The child who was denied love began to seek power as a substitute, and the universe, with its characteristic irony, had gifted her with abilities that would one day make her refusal to accept limitation into a force that could reshape reality itself. The first manifestations of her magical potential were subtle, barely noticeable events that might have been dismissed as coincidence by anyone not watching closely enough to see the patterns. A cup that shattered when her father's voice grew too loud. A mirror that cracked when she caught sight of her reflection and felt the familiar wave of self-loathing wash over her. Small objects that moved without being touched when her emotions became too intense to contain. These incidents frightened the household staff and provided her father with additional evidence that his daughter was indeed cursed, but they also represented something else entirely to the girl herself. They were proof that she possessed something that others lacked, a capacity that might one day allow her to transcend the limitations that had been imposed upon her from birth. The discovery of these abilities came at a time when her family situation was deteriorating beyond any hope of repair. Her father's visits to his mistress became longer and more frequent, while his interactions with his wife and daughter grew shorter and more violent. Her mother, caught between her loyalty to a husband who showed her little affection and her love for a daughter whose existence brought nothing but conflict, began to display the kind of emotional instability that suggested she was approaching some kind of breaking point. The final confrontation, when it came, was both inevitable and devastating in ways that exceeded even the worst of the child's fears. Her father, returning from one of his extended absences to find his daughter attempting to practice reading from one of the few books in their modest household, exploded into a rage that went beyond anything she had previously witnessed. The beating that followed was severe enough to leave marks that would take weeks to heal, but the words that accompanied it cut deeper than any physical blow could have managed. "You are not my daughter," he screamed, his voice shaking with genuine hatred rather than mere anger. "No child of my blood could be such an abomination. Your mother's elven ancestors, her cursed bloodline, that's what created you. You're proof of the corruption in this house. Evidence of sins that I should have ended before they could manifest in flesh." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, poisoning everything it touched with implications that the child was only beginning to understand. Her mother's response to this attack was perhaps even more devastating than the original violence. Rather than defending her daughter or challenging her husband's cruel assessment, she simply collapsed into tears and begged him to stop. Not because his words were untrue, but because speaking them aloud made the situation more painful than she could bear. In that moment, the child understood that even the parent who claimed to love her viewed her existence as a burden rather than a gift, a problem to be endured rather than a person to be cherished. The abandonment that followed was swift and decisive. Within days of that final confrontation, arrangements had been made for the girl's removal from the household. The story that would be told to neighbors and acquaintances involved a distant relative who had agreed to take responsibility for the child's upbringing, a fiction that allowed her parents to maintain their social standing while ridding themselves of the embarrassment her presence represented. But the truth was both simpler and more devastating. The hunchbacked girl was being sold to representatives of Aretuza, the academy where young women with magical potential were trained to become sorceresses. The transaction was presented as an opportunity rather than an abandonment, a chance for their daughter to find a place in the world where her differences might be seen as advantages rather than curses. The gold that changed hands was described as compensation for the family's loss rather than payment for an unwanted child, but the reality of the situation was clear to everyone involved. The night before her departure, her mother came to her room for what would be their final private conversation. The woman who had given her life sat on the edge of the narrow bed and attempted to explain the choice that had been made, to provide some context that might make the abandonment seem less like betrayal and more like sacrifice made out of love. But the words that emerged were hollow and unconvincing, platitudes about opportunities and futures that could not disguise the fundamental truth of what was happening. "They can help you in ways that we cannot," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face as she spoke. "Your gifts, the things you can do that frighten us, they understand such abilities at the academy. They can teach you to control them, to use them for good rather than allowing them to consume you. This is not rejection, my daughter. This is hope. This is the only chance we can give you to become something more than what this world would make of you." The girl listened to these explanations with the kind of careful attention that children develop when they know that their survival depends on understanding the motivations of the adults who control their fate. She heard the truth behind the comforting words, the relief in her mother's voice at the prospect of no longer having to carry the burden of an unwanted child. But she also heard something else, something that would sustain her through the dark years ahead. She heard genuine love, complicated and compromised, but real nonetheless, from a woman who was choosing to sacrifice her own maternal desires for what she believed to be her daughter's best chance at happiness. When morning came and the representatives from Aretuza arrived to collect their new student, the girl who would become Yennefer of Vengerberg walked away from the only home she had ever known without looking back. She carried with her nothing but the clothes she wore and the hard-won knowledge that survival in a hostile world required the kind of strength that could only be forged in the fires of absolute rejection. The child who climbed into the wagon bound for the academy was already beginning her transformation, though she could not yet imagine the price that change would demand or the power it would ultimately place within her grasp. The journey to Aretuza took several days, during which the girl had ample time to contemplate what lay ahead and to begin the process of emotional hardening that would serve as both armor and weapon in the years to come. The representatives who had purchased her services were not unkind, but neither were they particularly warm or welcoming. They treated her as what she was, a commodity that had been acquired for a specific purpose, valuable for her potential but not yet worthy of the respect that would only come with proven achievement. As the wagon rolled through landscapes that grew progressively stranger and more magical, as they passed through territories where the normal rules of physics seemed to bend and reality itself became negotiable, the hunchbacked girl felt the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. The world was vast and full of possibilities that her limited experience had never allowed her to imagine. Perhaps, in such a world, there might be a place for someone like her, someone whose differences marked her not as cursed, but as chosen for purposes that others could not understand. The pain of her abandonment would never fully heal, and the scars left by her family's rejection would influence every relationship she would ever attempt to form. But as she approached the academy where she would learn to transform both her body and her understanding of her own worth, the girl was already beginning to grasp a truth that would sustain her through the trials ahead. The love that had been denied her by those who should have provided it unconditionally could perhaps be earned through the demonstration of power and achievement that no one could ignore or dismiss. She would learn to be beautiful because beauty commanded respect that deformity never could. She would master magic because magical power placed her beyond the reach of those who would dismiss her as merely human. Most importantly, she would develop the kind of emotional control that would prevent anyone from ever hurting her as deeply as her own family had managed to hurt her. The sorceress she was destined to become was already taking shape in the mind of the abandoned child, and with each mile that carried her further from her past, she grew more determined to ensure that no one would ever again have the power to make her feel worthless or unwanted. The academy that awaited her would provide the tools and training necessary for such a transformation, but the driving force behind her metamorphosis was already burning within her heart. She would show the world, and most particularly the parents who had cast her aside, that their monster daughter could become something magnificent and terrible, worthy of love or fear, but never again subject to the casual cruelty that had defined her earliest years. The hunchbacked child was dying with each turn of the wagon's wheels, and in her place was rising something that the world had never seen before and would never be able to forget once it emerged into the light. The ancient towers of Aretuza rose from the sea like accusations against the sky, their weathered stones bearing witness to centuries of transformation and triumph, of young women who had arrived broken and left remade into instruments of power that kings would fear and emperors would court. The academy that had been built on an island specifically to isolate its students from the mundane world represented more than mere education. It was a forge where human souls were melted down and recast according to specifications that bore little resemblance to the original material. The girl who would become Yennefer arrived at these forbidding gates at the age of 13, still bearing the curved spine and twisted limbs that had marked her for abandonment, but carrying within her consciousness something that the Academy's recruiters had recognized as more precious than gold or gems. Raw magical potential crackled beneath her deformed exterior like lightning trapped in a bottle, waiting for the proper techniques to channel it into forms that could reshape reality according to will and desire. Her first glimpse of Aretuza's interior revealed a world unlike anything her limited experience had prepared her to understand. Corridors that seemed to bend and flow according to principles that defied conventional architecture. Classrooms where the very air shimmered with barely contained magical energies. Dormitories filled with girls whose beauty was so perfect, so precisely calibrated, that it seemed artificial rather than natural, as indeed it was. The other students who populated this strange academy represented every kingdom and culture of the known world, but they shared certain characteristics that immediately set them apart from ordinary young women. Their faces held the kind of flawless symmetry that artists spent lifetimes trying to capture, their bodies curved and proportioned according to mathematical principles of aesthetic perfection. Most unsettling of all was their eyes, which held depths of knowledge and experience that seemed impossible in individuals so young. These were the sorceresses in training, girls who had undergone the first stages of transformation that would eventually make them among the most powerful individuals in the world. Their beauty was not a gift of birth but an achievement of science and magic, purchased through processes that the new arrival was only beginning to understand. The casual way they discussed their previous appearances, the matter-of-fact references to procedures and modifications that had reshaped both their bodies and their fundamental relationship with human nature, suggested a worldview that placed power and effectiveness far above comfort or familiarity. The instructors who governed this institution were even more intimidating than the students, women whose mastery of magical arts had elevated them beyond ordinary human limitations, but had also cut them off from much of what made existence warm and meaningful. They moved through the academy's halls with the kind of purposeful efficiency that characterized those who viewed emotion as weakness and sentiment as obstacle to achievement. Their interactions with students were characterized by high expectations and ruthless assessment, creating an atmosphere where failure was not merely disappointing but potentially fatal. Chief among these formidable figures was Tissaia de Vries, the rector of Aretuza, whose reputation extended far beyond the academy's walls to encompass some of the most significant magical and political events of the age. She was a woman who had achieved the kind of power that allowed her to reshape nations through carefully placed suggestions and strategically applied pressure, yet who had chosen to dedicate her abilities to the training of the next generation of sorceresses. Her reasons for making such a choice remained mysterious. but her commitment to excellence was beyond question. When Tisaya first encountered the hunchback girl who had been delivered to her academy, her assessment was swift and comprehensive. The physical deformities were obvious and significant, but they were also temporary obstacles that could be addressed through procedures that Aretusa had perfected over generations of similar challenges. More important was the magical potential that burned within the child like a furnace barely contained by inadequate housing, power that could be developed into something truly remarkable given proper guidance and sufficient motivation. The conversation that followed between rector and student was unlike any the girl had ever experienced, characterized by a directness and honesty that cut through years of euphemism and careful avoidance of difficult truths. Tisaya did not pretend that the transformation ahead would be comfortable or easy, nor did she minimize the risks involved in the magical procedures that would be required to reshape both body and mind according to the Academy's standards of perfection. "You are here because you possess abilities that others lack," Tisaya explained, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made questioning seem not merely pointless but actively dangerous. But potential without discipline is merely wasted energy, and power without understanding is destruction waiting for an excuse to manifest. We will teach you to harness what you carry within yourself, but the price of such education extends far beyond anything your previous experience has prepared you to comprehend. The process of transformation that began immediately upon the girl's acceptance into Aretusa's program was both physical and psychological, designed to strip away everything that connected her to her previous identity and replace it with something more suited to the demands of sorceress life. The curved spine that had marked her as different from birth would be straightened through magical intervention, but such corrections came with costs that extended far beyond the immediate pain of the procedures themselves. The magical energies required to reshape human bone and tissue were drawn from sources that demanded payment in forms that ordinary people could barely imagine. Each correction to her physical form required sacrifices that nibbled away at aspects of her humanity that she would not fully understand until years later, when the absence of certain feelings and capabilities became impossible to ignore. The fertility that should have been her birthright was among the first casualties of her transformation, traded away for the physical perfection that would allow her to move through the world without the burden of others' disgust or pity. But perhaps even more significant than the physical changes was the emotional hardening that Aretusa's training demanded from its students. The Academy's philosophy held that sentiment and attachment were weaknesses that compromised a sorceress's effectiveness, obstacles that prevented the kind of clear thinking necessary for wielding power responsibly. Students were taught to view their previous emotional lives as childish indulgences that must be outgrown, replaced with the calculating rationality that characterized truly successful magical practitioners. The girl who had arrived at Aretusa carrying wounds from her family's rejection found herself in an environment where such pain was viewed as an advantage rather than a burden. The emotional scars that had shaped her childhood responses were reframed as evidence of strength rather than damage, proof that she possessed the kind of resilience that would serve her well in the challenges ahead. The ability to function despite profound hurt became a foundational skill upon which more advanced techniques could be built. The curriculum that governed her days was unlike anything that existed in conventional schools, combining theoretical study of magical principles with practical exercises designed to develop both power and control. Students learned to manipulate the fundamental forces that held reality together, to bend the laws of physics according to their will, to reach into the spaces between what was and what could be, and draw forth effects that defied common understanding of what was possible. But such abilities came with responsibilities and restrictions that were impressed upon students through methods that brooked no argument or appeal. The power to reshape reality was not a toy to be played with or a tool to be used for personal convenience, but a sacred trust that demanded the highest levels of discipline and understanding. Students who demonstrated insufficient respect for the forces they were learning to control found themselves subject to corrections that ensured such mistakes would not be repeated. The social dynamics within Aretuza were as complex and dangerous as the magical studies themselves, characterized by competition and alliance building that prepared students for the political realities they would face as practicing sorceresses. The girls who populated the academy came from backgrounds that ranged from noble families seeking to place their daughters in positions of influence to desperate parents who saw magical training as their child's only chance for a parent's better life. Such diversity created opportunities for both cooperation and conflict that mirrored the broader world's approach to power and influence. The hunchbacked girl found herself occupying a unique position within these social hierarchies, neither fully accepted by those who had arrived with advantages of birth and breeding, nor completely aligned with students whose backgrounds resembled her own experience of rejection and abandonment. Her growing magical abilities earned respect from instructors and peers alike, but her emotional intensity and obvious hunger for acceptance marked her as someone who had not yet achieved the kind of detachment that Aretuza valued above all other qualities. The relationships she formed during these formative years were complicated by the competitive atmosphere that characterized the academy's approach to education. Friendships were tested by examinations that pitted student against student. Alliances were strained by opportunities that required choosing between personal loyalty and individual advancement. The girl learned to navigate these challenges with increasing skill, developing the kind of political instincts that would serve her well in the courts and councils where sorceresses wielded their influence. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her education was the gradual recognition of what she was becoming and what such transformation would cost her in terms of connection to ordinary human experience. The beauty that replaced her physical deformities was undeniably striking, but it was also artificial in ways that set her apart from those who had been born with natural attractiveness. The magical abilities that grew stronger with each passing month opened doors to experiences that most people could never access, but they also created barriers to understanding and empathy that would complicate every relationship she would ever attempt to form. The final examinations that marked the completion of her basic training were designed to test not merely her mastery of magical techniques, but her psychological readiness for the responsibilities and isolation that characterize sorceress life. Students who had spent years learning to manipulate reality according to their will were required to demonstrate that they could do so without being corrupted by the intoxication of absolute power, that they retained enough connection to human values to use their abilities in service of something greater than personal ambition. The girl who had arrived at Aretuza as a hunchbacked outcast passed these tests with distinction, earning recognition as one of the academy's most promising graduates. But the woman who emerged from the transformation process was fundamentally different from the child who had entered it. Shaped by experiences and choices that had created something new, rather than merely improving what had existed before. The physical beauty that now defined her appearance was matched by magical abilities that placed her among the most powerful individuals of her generation. But such achievements had been purchased through sacrifices that would influence every aspect of her future life. The moment of graduation was both triumph and loss, marking the successful completion of a process that had remade her according to specifications that promised power and influence beyond anything her childhood dreams had dared to imagine. But it was also the final severing of connections to the world she had known before, the acceptance of a role that would set her apart from ordinary humanity for the remainder of her very long life. The sorceress who prepared to leave Aretuza's protective walls carried with her everything necessary to reshape the world according to her will, but she also bore the isolation that such power demanded as its price. Tisea's final counsel to her departing student was characteristically direct and uncompromising, a summation of lessons that had been learned through years of discipline and sacrifice. You are no longer the child who arrived at our gates seeking refuge from a world that rejected her, the rector observed, her voice carrying both pride and warning in equal measure. You have become something that the world needs but will never fully accept, powerful enough to protect those who cannot protect themselves, but too different from them to ever be truly welcomed among them. Use what we have taught you wisely, for the magic you wield is matched only by the loneliness it will bring. The young woman, who had once been a hunchbacked outcast, listened to these words with the kind of careful attention that had characterized her entire education, understanding that they represented both promise and prophecy for the life that stretched ahead of her. She had achieved everything that she had dreamed of during her darkest moments of childhood rejection, had transformed herself into something beautiful and powerful beyond her wildest imaginations. But she was also beginning to understand that such transformation came with costs that extended far beyond the immediate pain of the procedures that had reshaped her body. The world that awaited her beyond Aretusa's walls was one where her abilities would be valued, but her humanity would be questioned. Where her power would command respect, but her capacity for normal relationships would be forever compromised by the very achievements that had made such power possible. She would be courted by kings and feared by armies, consulted by the wise and avoided by the innocent. But she would also discover that the price of transcending ordinary human limitations was the loss of much that made existence warm and meaningful. As she prepared to take her first steps on the path that would lead her through decades of adventure and heartbreak, triumph and tragedy, the woman who now bore the name Yennefer of Vengerberg carried with her both the tools necessary to reshape the world and the growing understanding that such power was as much burden as blessing. The academy had given her everything she thought she wanted, but it had also taken away things she had not known she possessed until they were gone. The sorceress who walked away from the towers that had remade her was magnificent and terrible, capable of wonders that would echo through history, but also condemned to a loneliness that even her greatest achievements would never be able to fully dispel. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. The girl who had been abandoned by her family had died somewhere in Aretusa's halls, and in her place stood a woman whose story would become legend, whose choices would influence the fate of nations, and whose heart would prove to be both stronger and more fragile than any of the magical forces she had learned to command. The summer heat that settled over the northern territories like a suffocating blanket drove even the most dedicated travelers to seek relief in whatever shade and coolness they could find, transforming the normally busy roads into empty stretches of dust that shimmered with mirages born from desperation rather than magic. It was this oppressive weather that led Geralt of Rivia and his faithful companion Jaskia to abandon their usual pattern of purposeful travel in favor of a more leisurely approach to their journey, one that included frequent stops at any body of water large enough to offer respite from the relentless sun. The lake they discovered seemed almost too perfect to be real, its crystal-clear waters reflecting the azure sky with such precision that the boundary between air and liquid became difficult to discern. Ancient trees surrounded the shoreline like sentinels, their broad leaves creating patches of blessed shadow that promised relief from the day's brutal temperature. For Jaskia, whose appreciation for comfort often outweighed his sense of adventure, the discovery represented exactly the kind of fortunate accident that made traveling with a witcher bearable, despite the obvious dangers such companionship typically entailed. Surely even the great white wolf can spare a few hours for fishing, the bard proclaimed, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical enthusiasm that characterized most of his pronouncements. Consider it an investment in our future productivity. A well-rested bard composes better ballads, and better ballads mean better reputation, which leads to better contracts and higher fees. It's simple economics, really, when you examine the matter from a properly analytical perspective. Geralt's response was the kind of non-committal grunt that served as his standard reaction to Jaskia's elaborate justifications for avoiding anything that resembled actual work. But his actions betrayed a willingness to accept the proposed delay. The Witcher's enhanced senses told him that they were alone in this peaceful location, far from the bandits and monsters that made most wilderness areas dangerous for casual recreation. Moreover, his own experience with the road's demands had taught him to appreciate opportunities for genuine rest when they presented themselves without obvious complications. The fishing expedition that followed was characterized more by companionable silence than by serious attempts to catch anything substantial enough to serve as a meal. Jaskia's technique with rod and line was enthusiastic but fundamentally unsound, while Geralt's approach demonstrated the kind of patient competence that marked all his professional activities but showed little evidence of genuine interest in the sport itself. The true purpose of their afternoon was relaxation rather than sustenance, and by that measure their efforts could be counted as entirely successful. It was Jaskia's line that first encountered the object that would transform their peaceful interlude into something far more complex and dangerous than either had anticipated. The resistance he felt was unlike anything he had experienced during his limited fishing career, too heavy to be a fish of any reasonable size, but too regular in its movement to be simple debris caught on the bottom. His attempts to reel in whatever he had hooked were met with the kind of stubborn opposition that suggested something had become firmly anchored to his tackle, refusing to be drawn to the surface, despite his increasingly frantic efforts. Geralt's intervention proved necessary to resolve the situation, his enhanced strength and superior technique finally bringing their catch to the shoreline where it could be properly examined. The object that emerged from the lake's depths was clearly artificial rather than natural, a small stoneware jar whose surface bore inscriptions in a script that neither man immediately recognized. The craftsmanship was evident in every detail, from the precision of the carved symbols to the quality of the materials used in its construction, suggesting that whatever lay within had been considered valuable enough to justify such careful containment. The seals that bound the jar closed were more than merely decorative, radiating the kind of subtle magical energy that made Geralt's medallion vibrate with warning. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure that whatever was trapped within would remain securely contained, using techniques that spoke of both power and desperation. The combination of magical binding and physical sealing suggested that the jar's contents were dangerous enough to justify extraordinary precautions, yet valuable enough to preserve rather than simply destroy. Jaskia's curiosity about their discovery was immediate and irrepressible, overriding whatever caution his limited experience with magical artifacts might have suggested. His hands moved toward the jar's fastenings with the kind of eager enthusiasm that characterized his approach to most mysteries, driven more by intellectual excitement than by consideration of potential consequences. The bard had always possessed the kind of inquisitive nature that made danger seem like opportunity, a trait that had proven both blessing and curse throughout his association with the Witcher. "Surely you're not suggesting we simply ignore this remarkable find?" he argued when Geralt's expression made his concerns obvious. "Consider the possibilities: ancient treasure, lost magical knowledge, perhaps even historical documents that could reshape our understanding of the past. We have a responsibility to investigate, both to ourselves and to the broader scholarly community that would benefit from such discoveries." The debate that followed was brief but intense, with Geralt's professional caution warring against Jaskia's irrepressible curiosity and his own growing interest in the jar's mysterious origins. The magical energies surrounding the artifact were clearly powerful, but they seemed to be directed inward rather than outward, designed to contain rather than to harm. The risk of opening such a vessel was real but manageable, particularly given Geralt's experience with supernatural threats and his arsenal of techniques for dealing with entities that proved hostile upon release. The decision to break the seals was made more from pragmatic considerations than from any desire for adventure or discovery. Leaving such a powerful magical artifact unopened and unexamined seemed more dangerous than investigating it under controlled conditions, particularly given the possibility that someone else might discover it and prove less capable of managing whatever emerged. Better to deal with the unknown while they were prepared and alert than to allow it to become someone else's problem at a time and place that might prove far less favorable for containment. The moment the final seal cracked and fell away, the atmosphere around the lakeside changed dramatically, as if the very air had become charged with energies that made breathing an effort and thinking clearly nearly impossible. The djinn that emerged from its stoneware prison was unlike anything either man had encountered in their travels, a being of smoke and flame and barely contained malevolence whose very presence seemed to warp reality around it. This was not the grateful spirit of folklore, bound by ancient laws to serve those who freed it from captivity, but something far more ancient and infinitely more dangerous. The entity's first act upon gaining freedom was not gratitude but violence, striking out at its liberators with the kind of furious energy that spoke of centuries of imprisonment and rage beyond human comprehension. The magical forces it commanded were raw and uncontrolled, lashing out in all directions without regard for precision or consequence. Jaskier bore the brunt of this initial assault, the djinn's power wrapping around his throat like invisible chains that threatened to crush his windpipe and silence forever the voice that had brought him both fame and fortune. Geralt's response to his friend's peril was immediate but desperate, drawing upon knowledge that he had never expected to use in such circumstances. The words that poured from his lips were not the carefully constructed magical formulas that witches typically employed, but something far more improvised and uncertain. In his panic to save Jaskier's life, he reached for half-remembered fragments of religious instruction, scraps of priestly wisdom that he had absorbed years earlier without fully understanding their significance or power. The exorcism he attempted was drawn from traditions that predated his witcher training, rooted in beliefs and practices that most people would have dismissed as superstition or wishful thinking. But the words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, charged with the desperation of someone watching a friend die, and the fierce determination that characterized Geralt's approach to any problem that threatened those he cared about. Whether through divine intervention or simple coincidence, the improvised ritual achieved its intended effect, driving the djinn away from Jaskier's tortured form and freeing him from the supernatural assault that had been slowly strangling the life from his body. The aftermath of the djinn's departure left both men shaken and uncertain, struggling to process what had just occurred and to assess the damage that had been inflicted. Jaskier's throat had been severely injured by the entity's attack, his voice reduced to a painful whisper that made communication difficult and performance impossible. For a bard whose livelihood depended entirely upon his ability to sing and speak with clarity and power, such an injury represented a catastrophe that threatened not merely his career, but his entire sense of identity and purpose. Geralt's own condition was less obviously compromised but no less concerning, marked by the growing realization that his connection to the djinn had not been severed by the creature's departure. The magical bond forged in that moment of desperate improvisation continued to link him to an entity whose power dwarfed his own, creating obligations and vulnerabilities that he barely understood. The first wish had been granted, but the price of that success was a relationship with forces beyond his control or comprehension. The search for healing that followed took them through landscapes still crackling with residual magical energy from the djinn's passage, evidence of the entity's power written in twisted trees and streams that flowed uphill against all natural law. The few people they encountered spoke in whispers of dreams that had turned to nightmares, of familiar places that had become alien and threatening overnight. The djinn's freedom had upset the natural balance of the region in ways that would take months or years to fully resolve. It was in the town of Rinde that they finally encountered someone capable of addressing Jaskier's injuries, though the circumstances of that meeting were far from what either had expected or desired. The town itself bore signs of magical influence, its streets filled with people whose behavior suggested they had fallen under some form of enchantment. The atmosphere was charged with supernatural energy that made Geralt's skin crawl and his medallion vibrate with constant warning, indicating the presence of magical workings far more complex and dangerous than anything they had previously encountered. The sorceress they sought was not difficult to locate, her presence announced by the obvious effects of her magic and the reverent fear with which the townspeople spoke her name. Yennefer of Vengerberg had established herself in Rinde like a spider at the center of an elaborate web, her influence extending throughout the community in ways that were both subtle and profound. The magical working she had woven around the town and its inhabitants was a masterpiece of manipulation and control, transforming ordinary people into willing participants in fantasies that served her own mysterious purposes. Geralt's first glimpse of her came not through conventional meeting, but through the elaborate game of seduction and power that she had constructed around herself. The bathhouse where she held court was a stage designed to showcase both her beauty and her magical abilities, filled with steam that carried the scent of lilac and gooseberries and charged with energies that made rational thought difficult and resistance nearly impossible. Every aspect of the encounter had been carefully orchestrated to create maximum impact. From the timing of his arrival to the casual way she acknowledged his presence without seeming surprised by it. Her appearance was everything that the stories had promised and nothing like what he had expected. Beauty so perfect that it seemed artificial rather than natural, which indeed it was. The transformation that had reshaped her from hunchbacked outcast to magnificent sorceress was evident in every line and curve of her form, but it was her eyes that truly captured his attention. They held depths of knowledge and pain that spoke of experiences far beyond her apparent years. Intelligence that burned like violet flame behind features that could have been carved by master sculptors working from divine inspiration. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Geralt's previous experience, characterized by a directness and intensity that cut through years of careful emotional defenses. Yennefer's interest in him was immediate and obvious, but it was also analytical rather than merely personal. The fascination of someone who collected information about dangerous individuals as a matter of professional necessity. Her questions about Witcher mutations and abilities were delivered with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having her curiosity satisfied regardless of how personal or intrusive her inquiries might seem. But beneath her obvious intellectual interest lay currents of attraction and recognition that neither had anticipated or fully understood. The magical energies that surrounded them both created resonances that went beyond simple physical appeal, touching something deeper and more fundamental than either had experienced in previous relationships. When she spoke of having never met a Witcher before, when she studied his mutations with the careful attention of a scholar examining a particularly fascinating specimen, Geralt found himself responding not with the defensive wariness that typically characterized his interactions with sorceresses, but with genuine curiosity about what she might discover. The negotiations that led to her agreement to heal Jaskia were complicated by layers of meaning and implication that extended far beyond the immediate transaction. Yennefer's demand for information about witches was clearly driven by more than academic interest, while her insistence on proper bathing and presentation spoke of someone who understood the importance of creating the right atmosphere for whatever was to follow. The casual way she dismissed conventional modesty, her easy familiarity with nakedness and intimacy, suggested a worldview that placed practical considerations far above social conventions. Their shared bath became a stage for mutual assessment disguised as casual conversation, each testing the other's knowledge and reactions while maintaining the pretense of simple courtesy. Yennefer's questions about fangs and horns revealed her familiarity with popular misconceptions about witches, while her obvious disappointment at finding him more human than monstrous suggested expectations based more on legend than reality. Her decision to render herself invisible during their conversation was both practical accommodation and subtle demonstration of power, allowing her to maintain eye contact while enjoying the privacy that magical concealment provided. The healing she performed on Jaskia was swift and thorough, demonstrating not merely technical competence, but genuine understanding of the magical forces that had caused the injury. Her treatment addressed not only the immediate damage to his throat, but also the underlying contamination that might have caused complications later. Work that spoke of someone who understood both the jinn's nature and the specific requirements of countering its malevolent influence. The ease with which she accomplished what should have been a complex and dangerous procedure marked her as a sorceress of considerable power and experience. But it was the price she demanded for her services that revealed the true complexity of her character and motivations. Her interest in the jinn that had caused Jaskia's injuries was clearly professional rather than merely curious, driven by purposes that she was not yet prepared to reveal. When Geralt admitted to possessing the seal that could command the entity, when he allowed her to believe that Jaskia still carried that vital artifact, he was entering into negotiations whose full implications neither of them yet understood. The magical compulsion she placed upon him was both violation and seduction, a demonstration of power that transformed him into an unwilling instrument of her will, while maintaining the fiction that he was acting from his own motivations. The spell she wove around his consciousness was subtle enough that he felt no immediate awareness of its influence, experiencing her commands as his own desires and her goals as natural extensions of his own moral principles. It was magic of the highest order, requiring not merely raw power, but sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the delicate mechanisms of will and choice. The actions he performed while under her influence would haunt him for months afterward, not because they were evil in themselves, but because they represented a fundamental violation of his autonomy and moral agency. The town councillors he attacked and humiliated had indeed treated Yennefer badly, their fear and prejudice driving them to actions that deserved punishment. But the choice to deliver that punishment should have been his own, made after careful consideration of the circumstances and consequences, rather than imposed through magical manipulation that bypassed his conscious decision-making entirely. When he finally regained awareness of his situation, when the spell's influence faded enough for him to recognize what had been done to him, the sense of betrayal was profound and devastating. To wake in a prison cell with no memory of the actions that had placed him there, to learn that he had become a weapon in someone else's hands, challenged everything he believed about his own agency and moral responsibility. The woman he had been falling in love with had revealed herself capable of treating him as nothing more than a useful object, her regard for his consent and dignity apparently secondary to her own mysterious purposes. Yet even as he struggled with the implications of her manipulation, even as he confronted the reality that she had violated his mind and will for her own ends, Geralt could not deny the connection that continued to draw them together. The scent of lilac and gooseberries that surrounded her had become as necessary to his well-being as food or water, creating a longing that transcended rational analysis or moral judgment. Her presence filled spaces in his existence that he had not known were empty, while her absence created a hollowness that no amount of professional activity could address. The final confrontation with the jinn, when Yennefer's attempt to become its vessel threatened to destroy both of them, forced Geralt to confront the true nature of his feelings for her and the lengths to which he would go to protect someone who had treated him so casually. The sight of her struggling to contain forces that would have consumed anyone else, her magnificent courage in the face of powers beyond mortal comprehension, revealed both her extraordinary capabilities and her fundamental refusal to accept limitations that others took for granted. His decision to use his third and final wish to save her life was made not from calculation but from instinct deeper than thought, the recognition that her destruction would represent a loss too great for the world to bear. The magic that bound them together in that moment of supreme crisis created something that transcended simple physical attraction or intellectual compatibility, a connection that would survive separations and misunderstandings that would have destroyed lesser bonds. The wish itself remained his secret in the aftermath of their shared ordeal, words spoken in desperation that had achieved effects neither had fully anticipated or understood. Whether the love that flowed between them was natural emotion enhanced by magical circumstance or artificial feeling created by supernatural compulsion would become a question that haunted their relationship for years to come, introducing doubt into what should have been the foundation of trust and understanding. But in the immediate aftermath of their triumph over the djinn, as they held each other among the rubble of the inn that had been destroyed by forces beyond mortal control, such questions seemed less important than the simple recognition that they had found something neither had expected to discover. The sorceress, who had spent years believing herself incapable of genuine connection, and the witcher, who had thought his mutations had destroyed his capacity for love, had discovered depths of feeling that challenged everything they thought. They understood about their own natures and limitations. The love that began in that moment would prove to be both blessing and curse, a source of joy and pain that would define both their lives for decades to come. It was a connection forged in magic, but sustained by genuine recognition of worth, passion born from mutual understanding of isolation and difference, hope discovered in the most unlikely circumstances by two people who had learned not to expect happiness from a world that had given them little reason for optimism. As they prepared to face whatever future awaited them, as they contemplated the implications of bonds that neither fully understood, Geralt and Yennefer carried with them the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious in each other. The path ahead would test that connection in ways they could not anticipate, but the foundation had been laid for a love story that would become legend, a tale of two souls who discovered that even the most damaged hearts could heal when they found their proper match. The djinn was gone, its ancient malevolence finally free to return to whatever realm had spawned it, but the consequences of its brief freedom would echo through their lives for years to come. The wish that had saved Yennefer's life had also bound them together in ways that neither magic nor time could easily sever, creating a relationship that would survive wars and betrayals, separations and reunions, triumph and tragedy in equal measure. The year that Geralt and Yennefer spent together in her tower at Vengerberg passed like a dream wrapped in silk and scented with lilac and gooseberries, a period of domestic tranquility that neither had ever expected to experience or believed themselves capable of sustaining. The sorceress, who had spent decades defining herself through power and independence, discovered unexpected joy in the simple rhythms of shared existence. While the witcher, who had walked the path alone since leaving Kaer Morhen, learned that solitude was not the inevitable price of his mutations, but a choice that could be unmade when the right companion presented herself. The tower itself became a sanctuary from the outside world's demands and expectations, its rooms filled with the accumulated treasures of Yennefer's long career and the comfortable evidence of two lives slowly intertwining. Her library contained works that represented centuries of magical scholarship, grimoires whose secrets could reshape reality, and treatises on subjects that most people could barely imagine. But it also held Geralt's travel-worn books and the simple possessions of someone whose entire life could be packed onto a single horse, creating an odd but harmonious blend of the exotic and the practical. Their days together followed patterns that neither had consciously established, but both found deeply satisfying, routines that grew from mutual accommodation rather than imposed structure. Yennefer would wake first, her sorceress training having accustomed her to functioning with less sleep than ordinary people required, and spend her early morning hours attending to correspondence with colleagues and clients whose problems demanded her expertise. Geralt would rise later, his enhanced senses telling him exactly when she had finished her professional obligations and was ready for the kind of attention that could not be shared with distant supplicants. The intimacy they shared went far beyond the merely physical, though their passion for each other remained as intense and consuming as it had been during their first encounter in Rinde's bathhouse. They had discovered in each other someone who understood the burdens of being fundamentally different from ordinary humanity, the isolation that came with abilities that set them apart from those they protected. Their lovemaking was both celebration and consolation, acknowledgement of connection, and defiance of the loneliness that had defined so much of their previous existence. But perhaps more remarkable than their physical compatibility was the intellectual partnership that developed between them, the way their different types of knowledge and experience complemented each other to create understanding neither could have achieved alone. Yennefer's theoretical mastery of magical principles combined with Geralt's practical experience of supernatural threats to generate insights that advanced both their professional capabilities and their personal comprehension of Baysense, the forces that shaped their world. The collection of artifacts that filled Yennefer's private chambers spoke to interests and appetites that extended far beyond conventional, scholarly pursuits, representing a curiosity about the boundaries of experience that conventional society would have found shocking if not outright scandalous. The phallus of unprecedented proportions that she had acquired from a mountain troll was displayed with the same pride she accorded to her most valuable magical implements, while the magnificent stuffed unicorn that dominated her bedchamber served purposes that demonstrated her inventive approach to pleasure and her complete disregard for conventional limitations. Their experiments in intimacy took them to places both literal and figurative that neither had previously explored, adventures in sensation and connection that pushed the boundaries of what two people could share. The slope of a roof under starlight became a stage for passion that defied gravity and common sense alike, while the hollow of a dead tree provided shelter for encounters that seemed to draw energy from the earth itself. A canoe rocking on a rushing stream offered the kind of precarious pleasure that made every touch electric with danger, while their sessions 30 fathoms above the ground challenged both magical skill and physical courage in ways that left them both exhilarated and amazed. The unicorn that had served as the centerpiece for so many of their adventures eventually succumbed to the intensity of their passion, its stuffed form ripping open and collapsing in a shower of filling that marked the end of one phase of their relationship and the beginning of another. The destruction was both catastrophic and symbolic, evidence of forces that could not be contained within conventional boundaries, and a reminder that even their most treasured possessions were temporary compared to the connection they had discovered in each other. But even as they explored the heights of passion and companionship, even as they created between them something that neither had believed possible, the outside world continued to make demands that could not be ignored indefinitely. Yennefer's reputation and abilities made her services essential to kings and courts across the northern kingdoms, while Geralt's profession meant that monsters and supernatural threats would always require his attention, regardless of his personal preferences for domestic tranquility. The restlessness that began to manifest in Geralt during their second year together was not born from dissatisfaction with their relationship, but from the deep-seated need for purpose and movement that his Witcher training had. Ingrained in his very bones, the path called to him with a voice that grew stronger with each passing day of comfortable inactivity, reminding him that his mutations and abilities had not been granted for personal happiness, but for service to those who could not protect themselves from the darkness that stalked the world's forgotten places. His departure from Vengerberg came without warning or explanation, driven more by instinct than rational decision. One morning he simply was not there, leaving behind only the absence that spoke louder than any farewell letter could have managed. The choice to leave without confrontation or negotiation was born from his understanding that Yennefer would have arguments against his going that he would be unable to answer, reasons for staying that his heart acknowledged even as his nature demanded departure. The 4 years that followed their separation were marked by a mutual stubbornness that prevented either from reaching out to the other despite the longing that continued to define much of their emotional landscape. Yennefer threw herself into magical research and political intrigue with renewed intensity, seeking in intellectual challenge and professional achievement the satisfaction that personal connection had provided. Geralt returned to the familiar rhythms of the path with the kind of determined focus that suggested he was trying to outrun feelings that no amount of distance or time seemed capable of diminishing. Yet neither could completely escape the influence of what they had shared, and their separate journeys during those years of estrangement carried them both toward the inevitable reunion that destiny seemed determined to orchestrate. When word reached Geralt of a dragon hunt that promised both substantial reward and the kind of complex moral challenge that attracted the most skilled professionals, he found himself drawn to participate not merely by the prospect of payment, but by rumors that a certain sorceress had also agreed to join the expedition. The green dragon that had been sighted in the mountains near Holopoli represented exactly the kind of problem that brought together the most unlikely combinations of adventurers and fortune seekers. Its presence threatening enough to justify extreme measures, while its reported hoard promised rewards that could tempt even the most cautious treasure hunters. King Nidamir's decision to gather a diverse group of dragon slayers spoke to both the magnitude of the threat and his determination to claim whatever riches the creature might have accumulated during its long life. The expedition that assembled in response to the king's call represented a cross-section of the northern kingdom's most dangerous individuals, each bringing their own skills and motivations to what promised to be either a magnificent triumph or a catastrophic disaster. Boholt and his Crinfrid Reavers brought military discipline and tactical experience to the group, while the dwarven contingent led by Yarp and Zigrin offered knowledge of mountain terrain and underground warfare that might prove essential in rooting out a creature that had chosen such an inaccessible lair. But it was the presence of Yennefer among these hardened warriors and professional killers that transformed the expedition from a simple treasure hunt into something far more complex and emotionally charged. Her arrival at the gathering point was announced not by fanfare or formal introduction, but by the immediate change in atmosphere that her presence invariably created. A tension that spoke of power, barely held in check, and beauty that commanded attention regardless of the observer's intentions or desires. The reunion between Geralt and Yennefer was everything that 4 years of separation and unresolved conflict had made inevitable, a careful dance of attraction and resentment that acknowledged both their continued connection and the pain that their parting had inflicted on them both. Their first exchange of words carried undercurrents of accusation and longing in equal measure, each testing the other's emotional defenses while maintaining the pretense that their meeting was merely professional coincidence rather than destiny's design. Her explanation for joining such a dangerous expedition revealed motivations that went far beyond simple greed or adventurous spirit, touching on the deepest wounds that her transformation at Aretuza had inflicted. The fertility that had been sacrificed for magical power and physical beauty remained a source of pain that no achievement or recognition could fully heal, a loss that defined her understanding of what she had gained and what she could never recover. The dragon's blood that she sought represented not treasure in any conventional sense, but the possibility of undoing bargains that had seemed necessary at the time, but had proven more costly than she had anticipated. The revelation of her true purpose forced Geralt to confront his own assumptions about what motivated her actions and what she valued most deeply. The sorceress who commanded respect from kings and fear from armies was revealed to be someone whose greatest desire was for the most basic of human experiences, the ability to create life rather than merely manipulating the forces that governed death and transformation. Her willingness to risk everything for such a slim chance spoke to desperation that went far beyond professional ambition or personal pride. But their reconciliation was complicated by revelations that neither had anticipated or prepared to handle, secrets that transformed their understanding of each other and the forces that had shaped their lives since their last meeting. Geralt's admission that he possessed a child of surprise, that he had been granted by destiny the very thing she most desperately wanted and had chosen to reject it, opened wounds that went to the core of her identity and sense of cosmic justice. The fury that followed this revelation was both magnificent and terrible, the rage of someone who had spent years longing for what another had casually discarded. That Geralt had been offered a child through no effort or desire of his own, while she had sacrificed everything in futile attempts to restore her fertility, seemed to mock every choice she had made and every price she had paid. The cosmic irony was too cruel to be accepted with grace or understanding, too perfectly designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Their confrontation over his child of surprise became a battleground for every unresolved issue that had driven them apart 4 years earlier, each using intimate knowledge of the other's vulnerabilities to inflict wounds that would heal slowly, if at all. Yennefer's accusations of selfishness and cowardice met Geralt's defensive assertions about destiny and choice, creating a spiral of recrimination that revealed how little either had changed during their separation and how much pain their parting had actually caused. The dragon hunt itself became secondary to the personal drama playing out among the expedition members, though the creature they sought proved to be far more complex than any of them had anticipated. The golden dragon that confronted them was not the mindless beast of legend, but villain Tretenmirth in his true form, an ancient being whose wisdom and power dwarfed their own petty concerns about treasure and glory. His presence transformed their mercenary expedition into a test of character that would reveal the true nature of each participant's motivations and moral development. The revelation that their supposed green dragon was already dead, killed not by treasure hunters but by the exhaustion of protecting her young in a world that showed no mercy to creatures deemed monstrous by human standards, provided a mirror for their own situation that was both illuminating and devastating. The maternal instinct that had driven the dragon to fight and die for her offspring reflected Yennefer's own desperate longing for children, while the futility of that sacrifice spoke to the cosmic indifference that seemed to govern all their efforts to find meaning and connection. Villain Tretenmirth's final words to them carried the weight of prophecy and the sadness of someone who had witnessed too many mortal love stories end in tragedy. His observation that they were made for each other, but that nothing would come of their connection, was delivered with the kind of gentle compassion that made truth bearable while acknowledging its essential cruelty. The dragon had seen enough of love and loss to understand both the power of such bonds and their ultimate fragility in the face of pride and stubbornness. The separation that followed their mountain encounter was both inevitable and heartbreaking, the logical conclusion of conflicts that neither seemed capable of resolving despite their obvious love for each other. Yennefer's inability to forgive Geralt's rejection of his child of surprise was matched by his failure to understand why such a gift meant so much to someone who had achieved everything else she had ever sought. Their parting was marked by the kind of bitter words that would echo through their memories for years to come, accusations and recriminations that revealed how deeply each had wounded the other. The years that followed brought them together only briefly and under circumstances that seemed designed to test their connection rather than strengthen it. Encounters that revealed both the depth of their bond and the obstacles that prevented them from finding lasting happiness together. The incident at Edenvale, where Yennefer's relationship with the sorcerer Istrid forced Geralt to confront the possibility that she might choose stability over passion, became another battleground for their competing visions of what love should require and provide. The challenge to a duel that emerged from that situation revealed both men's willingness to die for her regard and their fundamental misunderstanding of what she actually needed from them. Neither Geralt's passionate devotion nor Istrid's scholarly affection could provide the sense of completeness that her transformation at Aretuza had denied her, leaving her trapped between competing forms of love that each offered something essential while failing to address the deeper wounds that defined her emotional landscape. Her decision to reject both suitors was born not from inability to choose between them, but from recognition that neither relationship could heal the fundamental damage that her pursuit of power and beauty had inflicted. The sorceress who could reshape reality according to her will remain powerless to undo the choices that had made such power possible, trapped in a body that was perfect in every way except for its inability to create the life she most desperately wanted to nurture. The final encounter at Bellatine, that magical night when social conventions were suspended and hearts could speak without fear of consequence or judgment, brought them together one last time before the forces of war and destiny would scatter them across the continent in pursuit of purposes larger than their personal happiness. The lovemaking they shared under the stars was both celebration and farewell, acknowledgement of what they had found in each other, and acceptance that such connection was not enough to overcome the obstacles that kept pulling them apart. Yennefer's advice that he should return to Sintra and claim his child of surprise carried the weight of someone who understood that some obligations could not be avoided indefinitely, that destiny would eventually demand payment for gifts granted and accepted. Her recognition that he was running from responsibility rather than toward it revealed an understanding of his character that went beyond their romantic connection to touch the deeper truths about what kind of man he was and what he was meant to become. Their parting that morning was gentler than their previous separations, but no less final, marked by the kind of mature sadness that comes from accepting that love alone cannot solve every problem or bridge every gap. They had found in each other something precious and irreplaceable, but they had also discovered that such connection carried demands that neither was yet ready to meet. The path ahead would take them through trials that would test every aspect of their relationship and reveal whether what they shared was strong enough to survive the challenges that destiny had prepared for them both. The love that had begun with a djinn's magic and a desperate wish would endure through years of separation and conflict, growing stronger rather than weaker as each learned through bitter experience what the other truly meant to them. But for now, they parted as they had so many times before, carrying with them the knowledge that they had found their perfect match in each other, while lacking the wisdom to make such perfection sustainable in a world that demanded choices between love and duty, between personal happiness and larger purposes that called them toward different destinies. The letter that arrived at Yennefer's tower in Vengerberg bore the unmistakable signs of having traveled far and through dangerous territory, its parchment stained with mud and its seals cracked from rough handling by messengers who understood the urgency of their mission without comprehending its true significance. When she broke the final seal and unfolded the pages within, Yennefer found herself confronting handwriting that she had not seen for years but recognized immediately. The careful script of someone who had learned literacy late in life and still approached the written word with the kind of respectful precision that marked all his professional activities. The opening salutation made her pause, a simple, dear friend that carried implications far beyond its surface courtesy. Geralt of Rivia was not a man given to casual correspondence, and his decision to reach out after years of silence suggested circumstances that had overcome his characteristic reluctance to ask for help from anyone, particularly from someone whose relationship with him remained as complicated and unresolved as their long history had made inevitable. The contents of the letter confirmed her suspicions about the gravity of the situation that had prompted him to break their extended silence. His description of the difficulties he was facing was characteristically understated, couched in the kind of diplomatic language that revealed more through what it omitted than through what it actually stated. But beneath the careful phrasing, Yennefer could detect the desperation of someone who had exhausted his other options and was turning to her not from desire but from necessity, born of circumstances beyond his control. The child he wrote about, the source of the supernatural disturbances that had driven him to seek magical assistance, could only be his child of surprise, the obligation he had claimed years earlier at a royal wedding and then spent more than a decade trying to deny or avoid. The fact that he was finally acknowledging his responsibility for the girl's well-being and training represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of destiny and duty, a recognition that some burdens could not be escaped through determination or geographic distance. Yennefer's response to his request was swift and decisive, though her reply carried layers of sarcasm and barely concealed anger that revealed how deeply his years of neglect and avoidance had affected her opinion of his character and judgment. The letter she composed was a masterpiece of controlled fury disguised as helpful cooperation, each sentence crafted to remind him of his failures while simultaneously agreeing to provide the assistance he desperately needed. Her journey to the Temple of Melitel was undertaken with the kind of purposeful efficiency that characterized all her professional activities, but it was also motivated by curiosity about the child whose existence had driven such a wedge between her and Geralt during their mountain encounter years earlier. The girl who had been granted to him by destiny's design was someone Yennefer had never met, but whose importance to their shared future she was only beginning to understand. The temple itself represented everything that Yennefer's magical education had taught her to view with suspicion and disdain, an institution dedicated to healing and nurturing rather than the pursuit of power and knowledge that had defined her own development. The priestesses who maintained this sanctuary operated according to principles that emphasized compassion over efficiency, spiritual growth over practical achievement, creating an atmosphere that felt alien to someone whose training had prioritized results above all other considerations. Mother Neneke, the temple's leader, proved to be exactly the kind of formidable opponent that Yennefer had expected to encounter. A woman whose authority was based not on magical power or political influence, but on moral certainty and decades of experience dealing with people who thought their problems were more important than anyone else's concerns. Their initial confrontation was a clash between worldviews as much as personalities, each representing approaches to healing and education that seemed fundamentally incompatible. The argument that erupted between them over Ciri's proper treatment and training revealed the depth of their philosophical differences while also exposing the protective instincts that both women felt toward the girl they had been charged with guiding. Neneke's insistence on gentle methods and gradual development conflicted sharply with Yennefer's conviction that the supernatural forces manifesting around Ciri required immediate and decisive intervention, creating a tension that would influence every aspect of the girl's instruction. But it was Ciri herself who provided the greatest surprise of their encounter, proving to be neither the frightened child that Yennefer had expected, nor the tractable student that Neneke's methods had produced. The young woman who stood before them carried herself with the kind of natural authority that spoke of royal blood and aristocratic training, but her eyes held depths of experience and loss that marked her as someone who had already faced trials that would have broken weaker spirits. Their first meeting was characterized by mutual wariness and assessment, each testing the other's strengths and vulnerabilities while maintaining the pretense of polite introduction. Ciri's immediate envy of Yennefer's beauty was balanced by her obvious fear of the sorceress's reputation and abilities, creating a complex dynamic that would require careful management if their relationship was to develop beyond mere tolerance into something resembling trust or affection. Yennefer's evaluation of Ciri's condition and capabilities was swift and professional, her magical senses detecting the untrained power that pulsed beneath the girl's apparently normal exterior like lightning, barely contained by inadequate insulation. The strength of these abilities was both promising and dangerous, offering the potential for extraordinary achievement, while also presenting risks that could destroy not only Ciri herself, but anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby when her control finally failed. The detection of Ciri's response to her star medallion confirmed what Yennefer had suspected from the beginning. that this was no ordinary child whose difficulties could be addressed through conventional teaching methods. The sensitivity to magical emanations that allowed Ciri to perceive the medallion's active properties marked her as someone whose connection to supernatural forces went far beyond simple talent or training, touching on abilities that were as much birthright as learned skill. The decision to take Ciri away from the temple's protective environment was made not from impatience but from recognition that the girl's development had reached a point where gentle methods and gradual progress were no longer adequate to address the challenges she faced. The magical disturbances that had prompted Geralt's original request for help were growing stronger and more frequent, indicating that Ciri's abilities were approaching a critical threshold that would require expert guidance to navigate safely. Their departure from the temple was marked by the kind of emotional complexity that characterized all significant transitions, with Ciri torn between gratitude for the sanctuary she was leaving and excitement about the training that awaited her. Nenneke's farewell carried both blessing and warning, acknowledging Yennefer's superior knowledge of magical matters, while expressing concern about the methods she would employ and the prices she might demand for her instruction. The journey that followed gave Yennefer her first real opportunity to assess Ciri's character and potential without the constraints imposed by the temple's protective atmosphere. The conversations they shared revealed a mind that was both quick and curious, eager to understand the forces that were manifesting around her, while also demonstrating the kind of analytical approach that suggested she would prove an apt student when properly motivated. But it was Ciri's emotional responses that truly captured Yennefer's attention and gradually began to erode the professional detachment she had maintained since agreeing to undertake the girl's training. The loneliness that marked so much of Ciri's interaction with the world around her reflected Yennefer's own experience of isolation and difference, creating a connection that went beyond the merely instructional to touch something deeper and more fundamental. The first lessons in magical theory and practice revealed both Ciri's extraordinary potential and the challenges that would face anyone attempting to guide her development. Her instinctive understanding of magical principles was matched by a stubborn independence that made her resist instruction when it conflicted with her own instincts or preferences, creating a dynamic that required patience and flexibility rather than the authoritarian approach that had characterized Yennefer's own education. The tests that Yennefer devised to measure Ciri's abilities were designed not merely to assess her current capabilities, but to reveal the underlying patterns of power that would determine the direction of her future development. The results confirmed her suspicions about the girl's exceptional nature, while also providing insight into the specific challenges that would need to be addressed if Ciri was to master her abilities rather than being mastered by them. The moment when Ciri first successfully drew upon the magical forces that surrounded them was both triumph and revelation, demonstrating not only her capacity for supernatural manipulation, but also the unique qualities that set her apart from every other student Yennefer had ever encountered. The ease with which she accessed power that others spent years learning to touch spoke to abilities that transcended ordinary magical training to touch something ancient and fundamental. But perhaps more significant than Ciri's magical development was the emotional bond that began to form between teacher and student, a connection that neither had anticipated or initially welcomed. Yennefer's role as instructor gradually evolved into something approaching maternal protection, while Ciri's respect for her teacher's knowledge and abilities deepened into genuine affection and trust. The first time Ciri called her mother was a moment that shattered defenses Yennefer had maintained since her transformation at Aretuza, revealing depths of longing and capacity for love that she had thought lost forever. The word carried weight beyond its literal meaning, representing recognition and acceptance that went far beyond the formal relationship between teacher and student to acknowledge bonds that neither training nor circumstance could adequately explain. The conversations they shared during their quieter moments revealed aspects of Ciri's past and personality that helped Yennefer understand both the girl's remarkable resilience and the wounds that still required healing. The loss of her grandmother and the destruction of her kingdom had left scars that went far deeper than surface trauma, touching core beliefs about safety and trust that would influence every relationship she would ever attempt to form. Yennefer's own revelations about her past, carefully chosen and strategically shared, provided Ciri with context for understanding the forces that had shaped her teacher's character and methods. The stories of transformation and loss, of choices made and prices paid, created a framework for comprehending why someone so powerful could also be so deeply wounded, so capable of both cruelty and compassion depending on circumstances and motivation. The magical instruction that formed the core of their relationship was unlike anything either had experienced before, combining theoretical knowledge with practical application in ways that pushed the boundaries of conventional teaching methods. Yennefer's approach was demanding and sometimes harsh, but it was also deeply personal, shaped by her understanding of Ciri's unique needs and capabilities rather than following predetermined curricula or established procedures. The lessons in control and focus that dominated their early sessions were designed not merely to teach Ciri how to manipulate magical forces, but to help her understand the responsibilities that came with such abilities. The power she wielded was not a toy to be played with or a tool to be used for personal convenience, but a trust that demanded the highest levels of discipline and moral development. The moments of genuine breakthrough, when Ciri successfully performed techniques that had seemed beyond her capabilities, were celebrated with the kind of pride and joy that characterized the best moments between any parent and child. Yennefer's satisfaction at her students' progress was matched by Ciri's delight at exceeding expectations, creating a dynamic that reinforced their growing emotional connection while also advancing the practical goals of magical education. But their relationship was not without its conflicts and challenges, moments when Ciri's stubborn independence clashed with Yennefer's demands for absolute obedience and cooperation. The arguments that erupted during these difficult sessions revealed both the strength of their bond and the areas where their different backgrounds and temperaments created friction that required careful management to prevent permanent damage. The nickname Ugly One that Yennefer used for Ciri was both term of endearment and gentle reminder of the standards that governed their world, a way of keeping the girl grounded in reality while also expressing affection that transcended physical appearance or conventional beauty. Ciri's initial resistance to this designation gradually gave way to understanding that it represented a form of love rather than criticism, recognition that true value lay in character and capability rather than superficial attractiveness. The development of telepathic communication between them marked a significant milestone in both their magical training and their personal relationship, demonstrating not only Ciri's growing abilities but also the depth of trust and connection that had developed between teacher and student. The ability to share thoughts and emotions directly created intimacy that went far beyond anything either had previously experienced, bridging gaps in understanding that words alone could never have crossed. The visions that began to plague Ciri during this period of intensive training revealed the scope of her abilities while also providing glimpses of futures that neither fully understood but both recognized as significant. The prophecies and possibilities that flowed through her dreams spoke of destinies that extended far beyond personal development or magical achievement to encompass the fate of nations and the balance of power throughout the known world. Yennefer's efforts to help Ciri understand and control these visions were complicated by her own limited knowledge of such phenomena, requiring her to rely on instinct and improvisation rather than established techniques or proven methods. The territory they were exploring together was largely unmapped, demanding courage and creativity from both teacher and student as they navigated challenges that had no clear precedents or guaranteed solutions. The monoliths that dotted the landscape around their training grounds proved to be more than mere ancient curiosities, revealing themselves as conduits for forces that connected different worlds and realities in ways that few could comprehend or safely manipulate. Ciri's interaction with these structures provided both opportunity for advancement and exposure to dangers that tested every aspect of her developing abilities and emotional stability. The shared dreams and visions that followed their experiments with the monoliths created a deeper level of understanding between Yennefer and Ciri, while also revealing the true scope of the challenges that lay ahead. The futures they glimpsed together were filled with both promise and peril, possibilities that ranged from triumph and fulfillment to tragedy and destruction, depending on choices not yet made and paths not yet chosen. But it was the approach of war that finally forced their departure from the temple grounds where they had found temporary sanctuary. As the conflicts that were reshaping the political landscape of the northern kingdoms made their isolated training ground increasingly dangerous, and their continued presence a threat to those who had provided them with shelter and support. The forced separation from Geralt that this departure entailed was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their situation for Ciri to accept, representing as it did another loss in a life that had already been marked by too many partings and abandonments. Yennefer's promise that they would always be together, that their bond transcended physical proximity or temporary separation, was both comfort and commitment, representing a depth of maternal feeling that surprised even the sorcerers who made it. Their quiet departure under cover of darkness was witnessed only by Neneki, whose blessing and farewell carried both hope and concern for the challenges that awaited them. The priestess who had provided sanctuary and initial healing understood that Ciri's development had reached a point where greater resources and different expertise would be required, but she also recognized the dangers inherent in the path they had chosen to follow. As they made their way through the war-torn landscape toward destinations that remained uncertain and purposes that were still developing, Yennefer and Ciri carried with them not merely the knowledge and skills that their training had provided, but also the understanding that they had found in each other something precious and irreplaceable. The sorceress who had thought herself incapable of maternal love had discovered depths of feeling that transformed her understanding of her own nature, while the girl who had lost everything in the fall of Cintra had found not just a teacher, but the mother figure she had never known she needed. The challenges that lay ahead would test every aspect of their relationship and reveal whether the bonds they had forged were strong enough to withstand the trials that destiny had prepared for them both. But for now, they faced the uncertain future together, united by love and purpose in ways that neither had expected to experience, but both had learned to treasure beyond all other considerations. The island of Thanid rose from the sea like a crown jewel set against the azure waters of the Yaruga estuary. Its ancient towers and elaborate gardens representing centuries of magical scholarship and political intrigue concentrated into a space small enough to walk across in an hour, but vast enough in its implications to reshape the fate of magical kingdoms. The conference that had been called to address the growing threat of Nilfgaard's expansion brought together the most powerful sorceresses and sorcerers of the age, individuals whose combined abilities could level mountains or raise them from the sea, but whose personal ambitions and conflicting loyalties made any unified response to external threats seem as impossible as controlling the tides themselves. Yennefer's arrival at the conference was accomplished through carefully planned subterfuge, her magical abilities allowing her to travel undetected by those who might have prevented her participation in the proceedings that would determine not only the fate of nations but the future of her relationship with Ciri. The girl she had come to regard as daughter accompanied her in disguise, hidden behind glamours and misdirection that concealed her true identity from all but the most perceptive magical practitioners. The political tensions that permeated every aspect of the gathering were immediately apparent to anyone with sufficient experience to read the subtle signs of alliance and antagonism that characterized interactions between individuals, whose power was matched only by their capacity for holding grudges. The sorceresses who had assembled on Thained represented different kingdoms and competing philosophies, their surface courtesy barely concealing the fundamental disagreements that would soon explode into open conflict. The Lodge of Sorceresses, though not yet formally established, already existed as an informal network of women who shared certain beliefs about how magical power should be wielded in service of political stability and social progress. Their vision of a future where sorceresses guided the decisions of kings and shaped the development of civilization through careful manipulation and strategic intervention represented a radical departure from traditional approaches to magical involvement in mundane affairs. Tisea de Vries, despite her advancing years and the burdens of leadership that had marked her features with the signs of constant worry and responsibility, remained the most formidable presence among those assembled. Her authority extended far beyond mere administrative control, to encompass the kind of moral leadership that made even her most powerful former students defer to her judgment on matters that touched the core principles of their profession. The younger generation of sorceresses, those who had been trained during the decades of relative peace that were now coming to an end, brought different perspectives and expectations to the conference proceedings. Their experience of the world was characterized more by opportunity than by struggle, making them perhaps less cautious about the potential consequences of dramatic change, but also more willing to embrace bold solutions to problems that their elders preferred to address through gradual adjustment and careful compromise. Yennefer found herself occupying a unique position within these complex dynamics, respected for her power and achievements, but also viewed with suspicion due to her known association with Geralt and the unpredictable variables that such relationships introduced into carefully calculated political equations. Her presence at the conference was both asset and liability, providing expertise that the assembled sorceresses needed while also representing connections that some viewed as potentially compromising. The formal sessions that dominated the early days of the conference revealed the depth of disagreement that existed among those who shared fundamental beliefs about the importance of magical involvement in political affairs but differed radically on questions of method and priority. The debates that erupted over response strategies to Nilfgaard's expansion exposed philosophical rifts that had been building for years beneath the surface of professional cooperation and mutual respect. Those who favored accommodation with the Southern Empire argued that Nilfgaard's superior organization and military efficiency made resistance futile, that the Northern Kingdom's best hope for survival lay in negotiated surrender that preserved some measure of local autonomy while accepting imperial oversight of major decisions. This faction viewed the conference as an opportunity to coordinate such negotiations and ensure that magical practitioners would retain their privileged positions within the new order that Nilfgaardian victory would inevitably create. The opposition, led by those who had witnessed firsthand the brutality that accompanied Nilfgaardian conquest, argued that submission would lead not to accommodation, but to subjugation, that the Empire's promises of fair treatment were tactical deceptions designed to prevent effective resistance until conquest was complete. These sorceresses believed that their magical abilities gave them the power to tip the balance of the coming war, if they were willing to commit themselves fully to the Northern cause. But beneath these policy debates lay deeper currents of personal ambition and historical grievance that transformed political disagreement into something approaching blood feud. The rivalries and alliances that had developed over decades of competition for influence and recognition now found expression through arguments about military strategy and diplomatic theory, with each faction viewing victory not merely as vindication of their strategic analysis, but as confirmation of their fundamental worth and wisdom. Ciri's presence at the conference, though carefully concealed, added another layer of complexity to proceedings that were already strained beyond the breaking point by competing pressures and incompatible objectives. The prophecies that surrounded her birth and the powers that were beginning to manifest around her made her simultaneously the most valuable asset and the greatest liability that any faction could possess. A prize whose capture might determine the outcome of the larger conflict, while also ensuring the destruction of anyone foolish enough to try to control her. The revelation of her true identity, when it finally came, transformed the conference from political debate into something approaching armed conflict, with different factions immediately recognizing both the opportunity and the threat that her presence represented. The girl whose bloodline connected her to the most ancient magical traditions, while also marking her as heir to one of the Northern Kingdom's most important thrones, became the focal point around which all other considerations would ultimately revolve. Tissaya's decision to bring Ciri forward and allow her to deliver a prophecy that might influence the assembled sorceresses was born from desperation rather than wisdom. A last attempt to find common ground among factions that seemed determined to tear themselves apart regardless of the external threats they faced. The hope that Ciri's visions might provide clarity about the future that would guide their collective decision-making proved to be tragically misguided, as the prophecies she delivered served only to intensify existing conflicts rather than resolving them. The visions that poured through Ciri during her prophetic trance revealed futures filled with violence and upheaval, images of cities burning and armies marching that confirmed everyone's worst fears while providing no guidance about how such catastrophes might be avoided. The specificity of her predictions, particularly those concerning the assassination of King Vizimir and the betrayal of various alliance agreements, served to inflame existing suspicions and accusations rather than creating the unity that Tissaya had hoped to achieve. The magical battle that erupted when the conference's protective spells were finally lifted was unlike anything that had been witnessed since the earliest days of the conjunction of the spheres, when reality itself had been fluid and the laws that governed existence were still being written by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The raw power unleashed by sorceresses who had spent decades accumulating knowledge and ability created effects that warped space and time around Thaned's ancient halls, transforming the island into a battlefield where conventional concepts of physics and causality held no meaning. Yennefer's participation in the combat was driven more by the need to protect Ciri than by any strong conviction about the political issues that had sparked the conflict, her maternal instincts overriding the strategic considerations that might have guided a more detached observer. The sight of her adopted daughter caught in the crossfire between factions whose hatred had finally boiled over into open violence activated protective responses that she had not known she possessed, transforming her from participant in political maneuvering into a force of nature dedicated to ensuring Ciri's survival. The chaos that followed made organized resistance or coordinated action impossible, with alliances shifting and reforming from moment to moment as the immediate demands of survival took precedence over longer-term political objectives. The carefully laid plans that various factions had brought to the conference dissolved under the pressure of combat that left no time for strategic thinking or tactical coordination, reducing the most sophisticated magical practitioners of the age to desperate improvisation and frantic attempts to stay alive. Ciri's escape from the immediate battlefield was accomplished through her own developing abilities rather than through any protection that others could provide. Her instinctive use of powers she barely understood carrying her away from Thaned to destinations that remained unknown to those who cared most about her welfare. The sight of her vanishing into dimensional spaces that existed between realities was both relief and tragedy for Yennefer, confirming the girl's survival while also separating them at the moment when their bond was most needed by both. The aftermath of the conference revealed the true scope of the disaster that political ambition and personal rivalry had created among those who should have been united in the face of external threats. The dead and wounded who littered Thaned's halls included some of the most talented magical practitioners of their generation, individuals whose knowledge and abilities had taken decades to develop, but could be destroyed in moments of uncontrolled violence. Yennefer's capture in the confusion that followed the battle was accomplished not through superior force, but through betrayal by those who had once been her allies and colleagues. Sorceresses who viewed her association with Geralt and Ciri as evidence of divided loyalties that made her too dangerous to remain free during the critical period that would follow Thaned's destruction. The accusation that she had orchestrated the conference's collapse for her own benefit or in service of Nilfgaardian interests was based more on convenient suspicion than on actual evidence. But it provided justification for treatment that reflected years of accumulated resentment and professional jealousy. The Lodge of Sorceresses that emerged from Thaned's ashes was born from the recognition that the old methods of magical cooperation had failed catastrophically, that new approaches and stronger leadership would be required if their profession was to survive the chaos that was spreading across the northern kingdoms. The women who gathered in the conference's aftermath shared certain convictions about the need for decisive action and unified command, but they also carried the scars and suspicions that made such unity difficult to achieve or maintain. Philippa Eilhart's assumption of leadership within this new organization was based on her reputation for ruthless effectiveness and her demonstrated ability to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by sentiment or moral qualms. Her vision of a future where sorceresses wielded power directly rather than serving as advisors to kings and princes appealed to those who had grown tired of watching their counsel ignored or their expertise dismissed by rulers whose understanding of statecraft was limited by conventional thinking and traditional prejudices. But the Lodge's approach to the Ciri problem revealed the fundamental contradictions that would plague their efforts to create lasting change through magical intervention in political affairs. Their recognition of her importance to the future balance of power was matched by their inability to understand or accommodate the personal relationships that had shaped her development and would continue to influence her choices, regardless of what strategic considerations might suggest. The decision to hunt Yennefer as a traitor, while simultaneously seeking to capture and control Ciri, represented the kind of tactical thinking that prioritized short-term advantage over long-term stability, ignoring the reality that separating the girl from those she trusted and loved would make her cooperation impossible to secure or maintain. The Lodge's members understood power and its applications, but they had little comprehension of the emotional bonds that gave such power meaning and direction. Yennefer's imprisonment and the interrogation that followed were designed not merely to extract information about Ciri's whereabouts and abilities, but to break her will and force her to accept the Lodge's vision of how magical power should be organized and applied. The techniques employed against her were sophisticated applications of magical theory that attacked both body and spirit, seeking to wear down resistance through carefully calibrated applications of pain and despair. But the torture she endured only strengthened her resolve to protect Ciri from those who viewed the girl as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished and guided. The physical agony inflicted by her captors was less significant than the spiritual violation they attempted. Their efforts to make her betray everything she valued most in pursuit of temporary relief from suffering that could be renewed at will. The information they sought about Ciri's location and intentions remained beyond their reach, not because Yennefer possessed exceptional resistance to magical interrogation, but because her ignorance was genuine. Her separation from her adopted daughter as complete as her captors had intended when they engineered the chaos at Thaned. The irony that their own actions had created the very obstacle that now frustrated their objectives was lost on interrogators who viewed every failure to extract useful intelligence as evidence of stubborn defiance rather than tactical miscalculation. The rescue attempts that various parties launched in efforts to free Yennefer from Lodge custody were hampered by the same political divisions that had destroyed the Thaned Conference. With potential allies unable to coordinate their efforts or trust each other's motivations sufficiently to mount effective operations, The magical defenses that protected lodge strongholds were formidable enough to deter casual intervention, while the political consequences of open warfare between different sorceress factions made direct assault too dangerous for all but the most desperate or foolhardy. The months of captivity that followed tested every aspect of Yennefer's character and resolve, forcing her to confront not only the immediate reality of imprisonment and abuse, but also the longer-term implications of the choices she had made and the relationships she had formed. The isolation imposed by her captors was designed to make her question whether her loyalty to Geralt and Ciri was worth the suffering it had brought upon her, whether accommodation with the Lodge's objectives might provide a path to freedom and renewed purpose. But the bonds that connected her to those she loved had been forged through experiences that transcended mere personal preference or temporary affection, creating obligations that could not be dissolved by physical separation or psychological pressure. The maternal instincts that had awakened during her time with Ciri were not subject to rational calculation or strategic revision, representing a fundamental aspect of her identity that no amount of coercion could alter or eliminate. The knowledge that Ciri remained free and beyond the Lodge's control provided comfort that sustained Yennefer through the darkest periods of her imprisonment, giving her reason to endure suffering that might otherwise have broken her spirit and corrupted her resistance. The hope that her sacrifice was protecting someone she valued more than her own welfare made even the worst torments bearable, transforming physical agony into something approaching spiritual triumph. The political developments that unfolded during her captivity revealed the ultimate futility of the Lodge's approach to the challenges facing magical practitioners in a world torn apart by war and conflicting loyalties. Their efforts to impose unity through force and fear created opposition rather than cooperation, driving potential allies into enemy camps while failing to address the fundamental problems that had made such drastic measures seem necessary. The escape that finally freed Yennefer from Lodge custody came not through external rescue or internal rebellion, but through the kind of magical accident that reminded everyone involved that forces beyond mortal control continued to shape events regardless of human plans or preparations. The dimensional instabilities that had been growing since Thained's destruction finally reached critical levels around the Lodge stronghold, creating opportunities for movement that even the most sophisticated magical barriers could not prevent or contain. Her emergence into freedom was marked not by triumph or relief, but by the grim understanding that the world she had known before her capture had ceased to exist, replaced by something darker and more dangerous than even the worst predictions had suggested. The war that had been brewing during the conference had finally erupted into open conflict, transforming the political landscape of the northern kingdoms beyond recognition while creating opportunities for those willing to exploit chaos for personal advantage. The search for Ciri that resumed immediately upon her liberation became the defining purpose of Yennefer's existence, driving her through landscapes transformed by war into alien territories where familiar landmarks had been destroyed and trusted allies had become enemies or simply disappeared. The trail she followed was marked more by rumor and hope than by reliable intelligence, forcing her to rely on instincts and emotional connection rather than the analytical methods that had served her well in less desperate circumstances. The knowledge that others were also seeking Ciri, that the girl's capture had become a priority for multiple factions whose intentions ranged from protective to exploitative, added urgency to a search that was already complicated by the chaos of wartime and the girl's own demonstrated ability to move between realities in ways that made conventional tracking impossible. The race to find her first became a competition between those who loved her and those who viewed her as a tool, with the stakes extending far beyond personal happiness to encompass the future of magical practice and political organization throughout the known world. As Yennefer made her way through territories where the old certainties had been swept away by forces beyond anyone's control, she carried with her both the scars of her imprisonment and the undiminished determination to protect the daughter of her heart from those who would use her power without regard for her welfare or happiness. The Lodge's betrayal had taught her that political considerations could not be trusted to guide those who claimed to serve the greater good, that only personal love and individual loyalty provided reliable foundations for action in a world where institutions and ideologies proved as fragile as morning mist when subjected to the pressures of genuine crisis. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with dangers that could not be anticipated and challenges that would test every aspect of her abilities and character. But Yennefer faced that unknown future with the knowledge that her purpose was clear and her resolve unshakable. Whatever price fate demanded for Ciri's safety and freedom, she was prepared to pay it, understanding at last that some bonds transcended political calculation or strategic advantage to represent the very essence of what made existence meaningful and worth defending. The escape from Lodge custody that finally freed Yennefer from months of imprisonment and interrogation came not through careful planning or heroic rescue, but through the kind of dimensional accident that reminded all involved that forces far beyond mortal control continued to shape events regardless of human schemes or preparations. The magical instabilities that had been building since Thaned's destruction had reached critical levels around the Lodge stronghold, creating fractures in reality itself that even the most sophisticated barriers could not contain or redirect. Her emergence into a world transformed by war and political upheaval was marked not by relief or triumph, but by the immediate understanding that everything she had known before her capture had been swept away by forces whose scope and implications she was only beginning to comprehend. The northern kingdoms that had provided the framework for centuries of magical practice and political alliance were dissolving under pressures that made previous conflicts seem like minor disagreements between neighbors, replaced by something darker and more desperate than even the most pessimistic observers had predicted. The journey to Skellig that followed was undertaken not from strategic calculation but from instinctive recognition that the islands represented one of the few remaining places where ancient traditions and loyalties might still carry weight in a world increasingly dominated by expedience and survival. The sea crossing itself became a trial that tested both her magical abilities and her physical endurance, demanding skills that had little to do with the sophisticated spell work that had defined her professional reputation, but everything to do with the fundamental will to survive that had carried her through her earliest trials. The Skellig Islands rose from the storm-tossed waters like monuments to endurance and defiance, their rocky shores and windswept heights bearing witness to centuries of successful resistance against forces that would have overwhelmed less determined peoples. The culture that had developed in this harsh environment was characterized by values that mainland kingdoms often dismissed as primitive or outdated, but which had proven their worth through generations of testing that separated the essential from the merely convenient. Yennefer's reception by the Skellige leadership was complicated by political considerations that went far beyond her personal reputation or individual circumstances, touching on alliances and obligations that connected the islands to conflicts raging throughout the northern territories. The accusations of collaboration with Nilfgaard that had been leveled against her by the Lodge carried weight even among people who had little direct knowledge of her actual actions or motivations, creating suspicions that threatened to make her search for sanctuary as dangerous as the imprisonment from which she had escaped. Craich, the Jarl whose authority extended throughout the Skellige archipelago, was a man whose understanding of honor and obligation had been shaped by traditions that predated the political complexities that now threatened to tear apart the established order of kingdoms and alliances. His initial hostility toward Yennefer was rooted not in personal animosity, but in genuine concern about the implications of harboring someone whose presence might compromise Skellige's carefully maintained neutrality in conflicts that seemed to offer no good choices for anyone involved. The negotiations that followed their initial confrontation revealed the depth of misunderstanding that separated different approaches to loyalty and responsibility, with Crouch viewing her association with Geralt and Ciri through the lens of traditional concepts of oath and obligation, while Yennefer struggled to explain relationships that transcended conventional categories of duty or alliance. The bonds that connected her to those she loved could not be adequately described through the political vocabularies that governed most discussions of such matters, requiring forms of understanding that went beyond mere intellectual analysis to touch something more fundamental about human nature and connection. But it was Crouch's memory of promises made years earlier, oaths sworn to protect and support the royal house of Cintra regardless of political circumstances or personal cost, that finally provided the framework for accommodation that allowed both parties to find common ground without compromising their essential principles. The recognition that Ciri represented continuity with obligations that predated current conflicts created space for cooperation that might not have been possible under other circumstances. The resources that Skellige could provide for her mission were substantial, but came with conditions that reflected both the island's traditional approaches to such matters and the practical limitations imposed by current circumstances. The ships and men that Crouch offered were volunteers whose participation represented personal choice rather than official policy, creating deniability that might protect Skellige from retaliation while still honoring the spirit of ancient commitments to Cintra's royal bloodline. The Temple of Freya that dominated the main island's religious landscape represented traditions and beliefs that predated the arrival of continental magical practices by centuries, offering approaches to understanding supernatural forces that complemented rather than competed with the theoretical frameworks that had governed Yennefer's education. The priestesses who maintained this sacred space possessed knowledge that had been preserved through oral tradition rather than written scholarship, creating continuity with ancient wisdom that mainland institutions had often dismissed as superstition or folklore. Mother Sigrifa, the high priestess whose authority within the temple matched that of any political leader, proved to be someone whose understanding of magical forces went far deeper than her modest demeanor might have suggested to casual observers. Her initial assessment of Yennefer's situation and needs was delivered with the kind of directness that characterized all Skellige interactions, cutting through diplomatic courtesy to address essential issues without wasting time on social niceties or elaborate explanations. The sacred diamond that dominated the temple's central shrine was more than mere decorative element or religious symbol, representing concentrations of magical energy that had been accumulating for generations through ritual and devotion. The size and quality of this gemstone made it potentially valuable for purposes that went far beyond ceremonial display, offering possibilities for magical working that could achieve effects impossible through conventional methods or ordinary materials. Yennefer's request to borrow this precious artifact for her own purposes was received with the kind of careful consideration that such unprecedented demands required, forcing the priestesses to balance respect for ancient traditions against recognition of extraordinary circumstances that might justify departures from established practice. The negotiations that followed revealed depths of theological and practical knowledge that challenged assumptions about primitive island cultures and their understanding of sophisticated magical theory. The vision quest that the priestesses required as proof of worthiness and understanding took Yennefer into realms of experience that her conventional magical education had not prepared her to navigate, demanding forms of courage and honesty that went far beyond mere technical competence or intellectual achievement. The spiritual trial that followed stripped away the carefully constructed defenses that years of professional success had created around her essential self, forcing confrontation with truths that she had spent decades trying to avoid or rationalize. The goddess who appeared during these visions was both familiar presence and alien intelligence, representing forces that existed beyond the ordinary boundaries of time and space, while also speaking to concerns and experiences that connected directly to Yennefer's personal history and deepest fears. The conversation that unfolded between them touched on questions of sacrifice and redemption that went to the heart of what it meant to love someone more than oneself, to choose service over safety regardless of personal cost or consequence. The memories that surfaced during this spiritual ordeal included episodes from her childhood that she had tried to forget or reinterpret, moments of rejection and cruelty that had shaped her understanding of herself and her place in a world that seemed designed to punish difference or vulnerability. The vision of her father's disgust and her mother's weakness forced her to confront the wounds that had never fully healed despite decades of achievement and recognition, acknowledging pain that continued to influence her choices and relationships. But perhaps more difficult than reliving past trauma was the requirement to examine her own actions and their consequences, to acknowledge ways in which her pursuit of power and beauty had required compromises that damaged not only herself but others whose only crime had been caring about someone whose priorities placed achievement above compassion. The recognition that she had become in some ways the kind of person who had hurt her most deeply as a child was both devastating and liberating, creating opportunity for growth that could only come through honest self-assessment. The prophecies that emerged from this vision quest revealed futures that were both inevitable and contingent, possibilities that would unfold according to choices not yet made and paths not yet chosen. The images of sacrifice and loss that dominated these glimpses of what might come carried weight that went beyond mere prediction to encompass understanding of the prices that must be paid for outcomes that mattered more than personal happiness or individual survival. The sacred diamond that was finally granted for her use came with blessings and warnings that reflected both divine approval and recognition of the dangers inherent in the mission she had undertaken. The power contained within this ancient artifact was matched by the responsibilities it imposed, creating obligations that extended far beyond mere technical application to encompass spiritual and moral dimensions that would test every aspect of her character and determination. The megascope that she constructed using Skellige resources and the temple's sacred gemstone represented innovation that pushed the boundaries of conventional magical practice, combining theoretical knowledge with desperate necessity to create capabilities that had never before been attempted or achieved. The device that emerged from weeks of careful work was both masterpiece of magical engineering and desperate gamble, offering possibilities for communication and location that might provide the breakthrough her search required, while also carrying risks that could destroy everything she was trying to protect. The volunteers who agreed to accompany her on the mission to the Sedna Abyss represented the finest traditions of Skellige courage and loyalty. Men whose willingness to face unknown dangers for the sake of ancient oaths demonstrated values that mainland kingdoms often claimed to honor but rarely practiced with such consistency or sacrifice. Their understanding that the expedition might well prove fatal to all involved did nothing to diminish their enthusiasm for participation, reflecting cultural priorities that placed honor and obligation above personal safety or comfort. The journey to the dimensional weak point that intelligence sources had identified as Vilgefortz's most likely hideout took them through waters that had been transformed by magical disturbances into something alien and dangerous, where familiar navigation techniques proved inadequate and conventional understanding of natural law could not be trusted to provide reliable guidance. The Sedna Abyss itself represented a nexus of dimensional instability that made it an ideal location for concealment, while also creating hazards that tested both seamanship and magical knowledge in ways that few had ever survived. The storm that engulfed their expedition as they approached their destination was not entirely natural phenomenon, but something enhanced and directed by magical forces that recognized their approach and sought to prevent interference with activities that could not bear exposure to outside scrutiny. The violence of wind and wave that threatened to destroy their ships before they could complete their mission represented opposition that went beyond mere environmental obstacle to encompass active resistance from enemies who understood the implications of discovery and exposure. Yennefer's decision to proceed with a reduced force when the majority of their expedition was scattered or destroyed by the supernatural tempest was based not on tactical calculation but on recognition that opportunities of this magnitude might not present themselves again, that the combination of intelligence, resources, and determination that had brought them this far could not be easily replicated if the mission were abandoned or postponed. The 8 volunteers who remained with her represented the essential core of their original force, men whose skills and loyalty had been proven through previous trials and whose commitment to their cause transcended mere professional obligation. The final approach to Vilgefortz's stronghold required navigation through dimensional spaces that existed partially outside normal reality, creating challenges that pushed both magical theory and practical seamanship beyond their ordinary limits. The castle that finally came into view was both architectural impossibility and strategic masterpiece, its towers and fortifications existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously while maintaining enough coherence to serve as effective base of operations for activities that required both security and access to various realms of existence. The assault that followed was complicated by defenses that operated according to principles that conventional military theory could not accommodate or predict. Magical barriers and dimensional traps that transformed familiar tactics into deadly miscalculations. The courage of her Skellige companions proved insufficient protection against forces that attacked not merely the body but the essential foundations of existence itself. Reality-warping energies that could unmake living beings at the fundamental level of their construction. The capture that ended her mission came not through superior force, but through treachery that revealed the extent to which Vilgefortz had prepared for exactly such rescue attempts, demonstrating knowledge of her capabilities and methods that could only have come from sources within her own circle of associates and allies. The ease with which her magical defenses were bypassed and her companions overcome spoke to planning that had anticipated every possible approach and prepared countermeasures that turned her greatest strengths into vulnerabilities. The imprisonment that followed was designed not merely to prevent escape, but to break her spirit and force cooperation through methods that combined physical torture with psychological manipulation of unprecedented sophistication and cruelty. The devices and techniques that Vilgefortz employed against her represented decades of research into the specific vulnerabilities of magical practitioners, creating forms of suffering that targeted the very sources of her power and identity, while leaving her physically capable of providing the information and cooperation that her captor required. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of her captivity was not the pain inflicted upon her body, but the knowledge that her sacrifice was serving Vilgefortz's purposes, regardless of her resistance or refusal to cooperate. The magical connection that existed between her and Ciri, the bond that had developed during their months of shared training and growing affection, could be exploited through torture that used her love against both of them, creating a situation where her suffering served to locate and endanger the very person she was trying to protect. The months of imprisonment that followed tested every aspect of her character and resolve, forcing her to find strength in sources that went beyond magical knowledge or professional achievement to touch the fundamental question of what made existence worth preserving despite pain and humiliation that would have destroyed weaker spirits. The isolation imposed by her captors was designed to make her question whether her loyalty to Geralt and Ciri was worth the suffering it brought upon her, whether accommodation with Vilgefortz's demands might provide relief from torments that could be renewed indefinitely at his whim. The visits from Vilgefortz himself were perhaps the most difficult trials she faced. confrontations with someone whose intelligence and magical abilities matched her own while being completely unrestrained by moral considerations or human compassion. His attempts to justify his actions through philosophical arguments about necessity and progress revealed a mind that had rationalized cruelty into virtue, creating a worldview that made any action permissible if it served purposes that he considered sufficiently important. The knowledge that Geralt was also being hunted, that her capture was part of a larger plan designed to draw him into traps that would complete Vilgefortz's collection of pawns and resources, added urgency to resistance that was already motivated by maternal instincts and personal loyalty. The possibility that her suffering might lead to his destruction transformed endurance from personal choice into moral obligation, creating determination that transcended mere stubbornness to approach something like sacred duty. The rescue that finally freed her from Vilgefortz's custody came not through external assistance, but through the kind of dimensional accident that had become increasingly common as the magical disturbances caused by various conflicts reached critical levels throughout the region. The same instabilities that had allowed her earlier escape from Lodge custody eventually created opportunities for movement that even Vilgefortz's sophisticated defenses could not prevent or contain, opening pathways that led away from her prison to destinations that remained uncertain but offered hope of eventual reunion with those she had been trying to protect. Her emergence into freedom was marked not by relief or triumph, but by the grim understanding that the world she had known before her various captivities had ceased to exist, replaced by something darker and more dangerous than even her worst fears had suggested. The war that had been threatening during her last period of liberty had finally erupted into conflicts that were reshaping the political and magical landscape beyond recognition, creating opportunities for those willing to exploit chaos while destroying the foundations upon which civilized existence had previously depended. The search for Geralt and Ciri that resumed immediately upon her liberation became the defining purpose of an existence that had been stripped of everything else that had once provided meaning and direction. The trail she followed was marked more by intuition and emotional connection than by reliable intelligence, forcing her to trust instincts that had been honed through months of suffering and deprivation, but which might not prove adequate for challenges that required more than determination and love to overcome. As she made her way through landscapes transformed by war and magical catastrophe, Yennefer carried with her both the physical scars of her imprisonment and the spiritual understanding that had emerged from trials that tested every aspect of her character and resolve. The woman who had once defined herself through power and beauty had discovered depths of strength that had nothing to do with magical abilities or physical appearance, finding in love and loyalty resources that proved more enduring than any of the achievements that had previously provided her sense of identity and worth. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with dangers that could not be anticipated and challenges that would demand everything she had learned about sacrifice and determination. But she faced that unknown future with the knowledge that her purpose was clear and her resolve had been tested by fires that had purified rather than destroyed her essential self. Whatever price the future demanded for Ciri's safety and Geralt's survival, she was prepared to pay it, understanding at last that some bonds transcended all other considerations to represent the very essence of what made existence meaningful and worth defending against any force that would seek to destroy or corrupt such connection. The reunion that finally brought together the three souls whose destinies had been intertwined by forces beyond their understanding or control took place not in the grand halls of kings or the ancient towers of magical academies, but in the smoking ruins of Vilgefortz's stronghold, where the debris of shattered ambition and the corpses of defeated enemies provided fitting testimony to the price that had been paid for family and love. The embrace that united Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri in that moment of triumph carried with it the weight of years of separation and suffering, the accumulated pain of choices made and prices paid in service of connections that had proven stronger than any force that sought to break them. The journey that followed their escape from Stygia Castle was unlike anything any of them had experienced before, marked not by the urgent flight from danger that had characterized so much of their previous existence, but by the strange peace that comes from understanding that the most important battles have been won and the greatest treasures have been secured. For the first time since childhood, Ciri could move through the world without constantly looking over her shoulder for enemies who sought to capture or control her. While Geralt and Yennefer discovered that their long struggle to find each other had finally resulted in something approaching domestic tranquility, their travels together took them through landscapes that bore the scars of recent conflicts but were slowly beginning to heal, villages where the smoke of war was giving way to the gentler fires of hearth and forge, fields where crops were again being planted by farmers who dared to hope that they might live to see the harvest. The world they moved through was not the same one that had existed before the great upheavals that had reshaped kingdoms and scattered armies, but it was a place where ordinary life was once again becoming possible for those who had survived the chaos. The simple routine that developed among the three travelers reflected their shared understanding that they had found something precious that needed to be protected through careful attention to the small details of daily existence rather than through grand gestures or heroic adventures. Geralt's enhanced senses, which had served him so well in tracking monsters and avoiding ambushes, now found their primary use in locating comfortable campsites and identifying the best routes through unfamiliar territory, while Yennefer's magical abilities were employed more often for practical conveniences than for dramatic displays of power. Ciri's development during this period was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. As the girl who had spent years being hunted and manipulated by forces beyond her control gradually learned to trust in the stability that her adoptive parents provided. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep since the fall of Sintra began to fade, replaced by dreams that spoke of possibilities rather than threats, futures that included choice and agency rather than predetermined doom and suffering. But even as they enjoyed this unprecedented period of peace and security, even as they discovered the joys of traveling together without urgent purpose or external pressure, the outside world continued to make demands that could not be ignored indefinitely. The Lodge of Sorceresses, though diminished by the losses suffered at Thained and subsequent conflicts, remained convinced that Ciri's abilities made her too important to be left under the guidance of people whose loyalty to broader magical and political concerns seemed questionable at best. The messages that reached them through various intermediaries and magical channels became increasingly insistent as the weeks passed, carrying threats disguised as invitations and ultimatums presented as reasonable requests for cooperation. The sorceresses who had seized control of their profession in the aftermath of various disasters were not prepared to accept that someone of Ciri's significance might choose personal happiness over obligations to causes that they considered more important than individual desires or family connections. Philippa Eilhart's communications, in particular, revealed the depth of frustration and growing anger that characterized the Lodge's response to their continued defiance of expectations and demands. The woman who had assumed leadership of the magical community's most powerful faction was accustomed to having her wishes treated as commands, her strategic vision accepted as inevitable reality, rather than contested through stubborn resistance to what she considered obviously correct policies and priorities. The decision to ignore these increasingly urgent demands was made not from defiance or disrespect for legitimate authority, but from recognition that the bonds connecting the three of them transcended political considerations or professional obligations, representing something that could not be negotiated away or compromised through diplomatic accommodation. The family they had created together was built on foundations that went deeper than strategic alliances or shared interests, touching essential truths about love and loyalty that made external pressure irrelevant to their fundamental choices. Their journey to Jealousy, where the remains of Ciri's former companions from her time with the rats lay buried, marked the beginning of a different phase of their travels together. One that was characterized less by simple wandering and more by purposeful pilgrimage to places that had played significant roles in shaping the person Ciri had become. The graves they found were simple affairs, marked by wooden crosses that spoke of hasty burial rather than elaborate ceremony, but the tears that Ciri shed over them carried weight that no monument could have matched. The stories she shared about Leo Bonhart's victims, young people whose only crime had been seeking family and belonging in a world that showed little mercy to orphans and outcasts, revealed aspects of her experiences during their separation that neither Geralt nor Yennefer had fully understood. The guilt she carried for surviving when others had died, for escaping dangers that had claimed friends who deserved rescue as much as she did, was both natural response to survivor's syndrome and evidence of the moral development that marked her as someone worthy of the powers she had inherited. The ritual of remembrance they performed together, simple ceremony that combined Ciri's memories with Yennefer's magical abilities and Geralt's understanding of honor and obligation, created closure that allowed the girl to finally move beyond the trauma of loss toward acceptance of survival and the responsibilities it entailed. The flowers that bloomed spontaneously around the graves were evidence of power channeled through love rather than anger, magic that healed rather than destroyed. Their subsequent travels took them to other sites that had played significant roles in Ciri's development, places where she had learned lessons about survival and sacrifice that had prepared her for the trials that followed. The arena at Claremont, where she had fought for entertainment and the amusement of crowds who viewed violence as sport, was burned to the ground in a fire that seemed to ignite spontaneously, but which served as fitting commentary on the values that had made such spectacles possible. The villages where they paused long enough to rest and resupply gradually began to generate stories about the three mysterious travelers whose presence seemed to bring justice to places where it had been absent and healing to wounds that conventional remedies could not address. The legends that grew around their activities were exaggerated in the way that all such tales become enhanced through repetition, but they were based on real events and genuine interventions that made life better for people who had little reason to expect help from anyone. The wild hunt that these stories described was not the supernatural force of legend, but something perhaps more significant. A human family whose bond with each other had created power that transcended individual capabilities to become something approaching divine intervention in the lives of those who encountered them. The three ghostly riders who appeared when injustice needed to be corrected and wrongs needed to be righted represented hope made manifest, proof that the world still contained forces dedicated to protecting the innocent and punishing those who preyed upon the weak. But even as they found meaning and purpose in these activities, even as they discovered that their combined abilities could accomplish things that none of them could have achieved alone, the private moments they shared revealed the depth of connection that made such cooperation possible. The love between Geralt and Yennefer had been tested and refined by years of separation and conflict, emerging stronger and more secure than ever before, while their shared devotion to Ciri provided focus and direction that transformed their relationship from something that existed for its own sake into a partnership dedicated to purposes larger than personal happiness. The intimacy they shared when Ciri was away on her own adventures was both celebration of their reunion and affirmation of bonds that had survived every trial that fate could devise to test their strength and authenticity. Their lovemaking carried with it the accumulated passion of years of longing and the profound gratitude of people who had found in each other exactly what they had been seeking without knowing what it was they needed most desperately. The conversations that followed these moments of physical connection revealed aspects of their relationship that had been impossible to explore during the years when external pressures and competing obligations had kept them apart. They talked about the future they might build together, the life they could create away from the demands of courts and councils, The possibility that happiness might be something they could sustain rather than merely experience in brief moments stolen from more serious pursuits. Geralt's dreams of a simple life filled with ordinary pleasures and daily routines spoke to desires that his Witcher training had taught him to suppress, longings for domestic tranquility that had seemed incompatible with the mutations that marked him as fundamentally different from normal human beings. The vision of a cottage where they could grow old together, surrounded by grandchildren who would carry forward the best aspects of their legacy while being spared the worst of their burdens, represented hope that he had never dared to acknowledge before finding the family that made such dreams seem possible. Yennefer's response to these fantasies revealed her own evolution from someone whose identity had been built around power and achievement to someone who understood that the most important magic was that which created rather than destroyed, which nurtured rather than dominated. The sorceress who had once sought to reshape the world according to her will now found greatest satisfaction in the simple act of caring for people she loved, discovering that maternal instincts could provide fulfillment that no amount of professional recognition or political influence could match. But their domestic idyll was inevitably interrupted by the approach of forces that viewed their happiness as threat to larger purposes and their unity as obstacle to plans that required Ciri's separation from those who loved her most. The Lodge's patience with their refusal to comply with demands and expectations had finally reached its limits, replaced by determination to secure cooperation through methods that went beyond persuasion or negotiation to encompass direct action. The final confrontation with the assembled sorceresses took place not in some neutral location chosen for diplomatic convenience, but in Monte Calvo, the Lodge's stronghold, where the accumulated power of the magical community's most influential members could be brought to bear on people who had proven resistant to less direct forms of pressure. The invitation that brought them to this meeting was phrased as opportunity for discussion and compromise, but the circumstances that surrounded it made clear that refusal was not considered an acceptable option. The session that followed was unlike any negotiation that any of them had previously experienced, characterized by ultimatums presented as reasonable requests and threats disguised as concerns for everyone's welfare. The sorceresses who had gathered to address the Ciri situation represented different kingdoms and competing interests, but they were united in their conviction that her abilities were too important to be left under the control of people whose priorities seemed focused on personal happiness rather than larger obligations to magical practice and political stability. Ciri's response to these demands revealed the extent to which her experiences had shaped her understanding of authority and obligation. Her willingness to consider the Lodge's arguments balanced by recognition that the people who claimed to know what was best for her had never demonstrated the kind of love and sacrifice that marked Geralt and Yennefer's relationship with her. The choice between duty to abstract principles and loyalty to individuals who had proven their devotion was not difficult for someone whose survival had depended on learning to distinguish between genuine care and manipulative self-interest. The argument that erupted when she declined to accept the Lodge's vision of her future was both inevitable and devastating, revealing the fundamental incompatibility between approaches to power and responsibility that could not be resolved through compromise or accommodation. The sorceresses who viewed her as resource to be managed for the greater good could not understand why someone would choose personal loyalty over political necessity, while Ciri could not comprehend how people who claimed to care about her welfare could demand that she abandon the only family she had ever known. The magical battle that followed was brief but intense, demonstrating capabilities that none of the assembled sorceresses had anticipated or prepared to counter. Ciri's abilities, refined through months of training with Yennefer and strengthened by the security that came from unconditional love and support, proved more than adequate to defend against attacks that would have overwhelmed less prepared opponents. The ease with which she neutralized threats from multiple directions simultaneously revealed the true scope of powers that the Lodge had sought to control but had never fully comprehended. But it was her decision to spare her attackers, rather than destroying them, that truly demonstrated the moral development that marked her as worthy of the gifts she had inherited. The restraint that she showed in the face of aggression and attempted coercion reflected values that had been instilled through example rather than instruction, lessons about mercy and justice that could only be learned from people whose own behavior demonstrated such principles in action. The departure from Monte Calvo that followed this confrontation was both victory and loss. Successful assertion of independence that came at the cost of relationships that might have provided support and guidance in the challenges ahead. The bridges that were burned in the process of defending their family's integrity could not be easily rebuilt, creating isolation that would make future trials more difficult to navigate, while also ensuring that such trials would have to be faced on their own terms rather than according to other people's expectations or demands. The journey to Rivia that concluded their travels together was undertaken not from any particular need to visit that troubled city, but from recognition that Geralt's connection to the place through his adopted name created obligations that could not be ignored indefinitely. The knight-errant, whose reputation had been built through years of service to those who could not protect themselves, owed something to the community that had provided the identity under which he had performed so many of his greatest deeds. The pogrom they encountered upon their arrival was everything that the worst fears about human nature could have predicted. An explosion of hatred and violence that targeted anyone whose differences made them convenient scapegoats for frustrations and fears that had no other outlet for expression. The sight of ordinary citizens transformed into murderous mobs by rhetoric that blamed their problems on people who had no power to cause or solve them represented humanity at its worst. Civilization's veneer stripped away to reveal the savage impulses that always lurked beneath the surface of social order. Geralt's intervention in this violence was both instinctive response to injustice and fulfillment of obligations that had defined his entire adult life. The Witcher's final demonstration that his mutations had never destroyed his essential humanity or his commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The battle that followed was not his greatest in terms of scope or supernatural opposition, but it represented the culmination of everything he had learned about courage and sacrifice in the service of principles that transcended personal safety or individual survival. The wound that claimed his life was neither dramatic nor particularly significant in tactical terms. A simple thrust from an ordinary weapon wielded by someone whose hatred had overcome whatever restraint or mercy might have prevented such violence. The mortal injury that brought down the White Wolf was delivered not by some legendary monster or supernatural force, but by the kind of casual cruelty that made heroes necessary in the first place. Proof that the greatest threats to civilization often came from within rather than from external enemies. Yennefer's desperate attempt to heal him using every resource of magical knowledge and emotional determination that she possessed represented love, made manifest through power. The sorceress's refusal to accept that death could claim someone she valued more than her own existence. The spells she wove around his failing body were masterpieces of magical theory applied with skill that transcended mere technical competence to approach art, but they were ultimately inadequate to counter wounds that had severed connections too fundamental to be restored through conventional means. The sight of her exhausting herself in futile efforts to accomplish the impossible was both heartbreaking and magnificent, demonstration of devotion that transformed professional competence into something approaching divine intervention. But even magic that could reshape reality according to will and desire had limitations that could not be overcome through determination alone, boundaries that marked the difference between what was possible and what was merely desired. Ciri's intervention in this crisis represented the full flowering of abilities that had been developing throughout her training and experience. power that had been refined through love and testing to become something that transcended ordinary magical practice to approach genuine miracle. The connection she established with forces that existed beyond normal reality created possibilities for healing that had never been attempted before, offering hope where none had seemed to exist. The boat that appeared to carry them away from the violence and hatred of Rivia was both vehicle and symbol, representation of transitions that went beyond mere physical transportation to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of existence itself. The vessel that bore Geralt and Yennefer toward whatever destination awaited them was not bound by conventional limitations of time and space, operating according to principles that reflected love's power to transcend even death when such transcendence served purposes larger than individual survival. The departure that followed was both ending and beginning, conclusion of one phase of their story and commencement of another that would unfold in realms beyond ordinary understanding or experience. The family that had been forged through trial and testing, love and sacrifice, had proven stronger than any force that sought to break it, creating bonds that would endure regardless of what changes might come to the world they were leaving behind. Ciri's choice to remain in the ordinary world rather than following them to whatever paradise or punishment awaited represented maturity and understanding that honored everything they had taught her about responsibility and love. The decision to let them go while continuing to live according to the principles they had demonstrated was both heartbreaking sacrifice and fitting tribute to people whose greatest achievement had been raising someone capable of making such choices with wisdom and courage. The legends that would grow around their story in the years that followed would inevitably become distorted through repetition and elaboration, transformed into something more comfortable and familiar than the complex reality of people whose love had challenged every limitation that the world tried to impose upon them. But the truth that lay beneath such tales would endure, testament to the power of connection and commitment to overcome any obstacle that fate or human malice could devise to test their strength and authenticity. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary tale, the completion of a journey that began with a hunchback child abandoned by those who should have cherished her and concludes with a woman whose love proved stronger than death itself, whose capacity for transformation extended far beyond the magical procedures that had reshaped her body to encompass the fundamental alteration of what it meant to be human in a world that often seemed designed to punish difference and reward conformity. The story of Yennefer of Vengerberg speaks to truths that transcend the boundaries between legend and reality, touching on experiences and emotions that remain constant across all times and cultures despite the fantastic circumstances in which they unfold. Her transformation from unwanted child to powerful sorceress to devoted mother represents a journey that anyone who has ever felt rejected or different can understand. A progression from isolation through achievement to the discovery that the greatest magic lies not in the power to reshape the world, but in the courage to open one's heart to others, despite every reason to keep it closed. The relationships that defined her existence reveal the complex nature of love itself, the ways in which genuine connection can survive misunderstanding and separation, while also demanding growth and sacrifice that comfortable affection never requires. Her bond with Geralt demonstrated that the deepest partnerships are forged not through convenience or compatibility, but through mutual recognition of essential worth that transcends surface differences or temporary conflicts. Their love was tested by forces that would have destroyed lesser connections, refined by trials that revealed both their individual strength and their combined power to overcome obstacles that neither could have faced alone. But perhaps even more significant than her romantic relationship was the maternal love she discovered through Ciri. The transformation from someone who defined herself through power and achievement to someone who understood that the greatest accomplishment lay in nurturing another person's development without seeking to control or possess them The fierce protectiveness she displayed when her adopted daughter was threatened represented love in its purest form, devotion that placed another's welfare above all other considerations, including personal survival and happiness. The choices she made throughout her long life reflected an evolution from someone who sought to take what the world had denied her to someone who chose to give what others needed most desperately. The woman who had begun by pursuing beauty and power as compensation for childhood rejection ended by discovering that true fulfillment came through service to people she valued more than herself, that the magic she wielded was most meaningful when it was used to heal rather than to dominate. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for those she loved demonstrated the kind of moral courage that transforms ordinary individuals into legends worthy of remembrance. The prices she paid for the connections that gave her life meaning were steep beyond most people's ability to comprehend. But she paid them without hesitation or regret because she understood that some bonds are worth any cost that fate might demand as payment for their preservation. The transformation that carried her from monster to beauty to mother to legend represents hope for anyone who has ever felt trapped by circumstances or limited by the expectations that others place upon them. Her story reminds us that change is always possible for those who possess sufficient courage and determination, that the barriers that seem most insurmountable often prove to be illusions that dissolve when faced with genuine love and authentic purpose. The family she found with Geralt and Ciri transcended the conventional boundaries of blood and law to create something more powerful and enduring than either biology or social convention could provide. Their bond was forged through shared trials and mutual sacrifice, strengthened by the understanding that they had chosen each other from among all the possibilities that the world offered, that their connection was not accident or obligation, but the result of recognition that went deeper than mere preference or convenience. The love that united them proved stronger than the forces of war and politics that sought to tear them apart, more enduring than the magical powers that individuals wielded, more significant than the kingdoms and empires that rose and fell around them. Their story demonstrates that even in a world dominated by violence and driven by ambition, there remain connections that can neither be broken by force nor corrupted by self-interest. Bonds that represent the best possibilities of human nature when guided by wisdom and tempered by sacrifice. As you prepare for sleep, let yourself find comfort in the knowledge that transformation is always possible, that love can indeed conquer the obstacles that seem most impossible to overcome, and that the connections we forge with others represent the most enduring magic available to mortals who seek meaning in existence that often appears random and cruel. The woman who began as society's cast-off became someone whose story continues to inspire hope in all who encounter it, proof that our origins need not determine our destinations, and that the greatest achievements are measured not in power accumulated, but in love shared. Rest now in the understanding that every ending contains the seeds of new beginning, that every story of redemption encourages others to believe in their own possibility for growth and change. The tale of Yennefer of Vengerberg reminds us that beauty lies not in perfection, but in the courage to love despite vulnerability. That strength comes not from invulnerability, but from the willingness to risk everything for those who matter most. Sleep peacefully, knowing that in a world where magic and mundane reality intertwine, where destinies unfold according to choices made in moments of crisis and revelation, the greatest enchantment remains the simple recognition that we are not alone, that somewhere in the vast tapestry of existence there are souls who will love us, not despite our differences but because of them, who will stand with us against whatever darkness threatens to overwhelm the light we carry within ourselves. Let your dreams be filled not with the sorrows that marked the beginning of her journey, but with the joy that crowned its conclusion, the understanding that even the most damaged hearts can heal when they find their proper home, and the hope that your own story, however it may begin, carries within it the possibility for transformation as profound and beautiful as any that legend has ever recorded. The path may be difficult and the destination uncertain, but love provides both compass and strength for any journey worth undertaking.